In the forgotten wilds of northern Montana, there stood an abandoned farm. Knee-high weeds swayed in the wind, rust clung to every tin roof, and the creaking wooden door moaned like old ghosts whispering stories no one wanted to hear. But among the decay, someone once found a creature. Not a ghost, not quite a dog either. His name was Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, but not the kind people dream of raising. He once belonged to someone who didn't understand love, only power. They said his former owner was a gang enforcer, a man who trained dogs to intimidate like walking weapons. The Ranger wasn't taught to trust, only to attack, not to obey, but to snarl until grown men froze. He had no loving nickname, only barked commands and the sting of a whip. When they found Ranger, he was chained to a broken beam in an old barn. The chain was rusted, his ribs sharp beneath his skin, and that once glorious coat of his, matted with dried blood and dirt. But what silenced the rescue team wasn't the wounds. It was his eyes. Not wild, not even angry, just empty. As if his soul had left long ago, leaving only a body that growled to stay alive. They brought Ranger to Hope Trail's rescue center, a haven for the broken, as its founder often said. But even here, a place that had healed the most wounded souls, Ranger was the exception. For 8 months, he never let anyone near without snarling or lunging, especially men. No one knew exactly what had been done to him, but whenever a man walked by, Ranger would bare his teeth, body lowered, ready to strike if the bars hadn't been there. A bold red sign hung on Ranger's kennel. Do not approach, dangerous. New volunteers were firmly warned. Don't even try to make friends. Some even suggested Ranger be removed from rehab and sent to a behavior isolation unit. But something in his eyes, yes, even when they were at their fiercest, made a few people hesitate. Something wordless, like a panicked child trapped in the body of a broken warrior. Ranger barely moved in his corner. He didn't play. He didn't bark. He showed no interest in the world beyond metal. He growled when approached, and turned his face to the wall when left alone. Blankets were shredded within days. Food had to be placed when he wasn't looking, or he'd back away, eyes locked on every hand movement, waiting for harm. No one blamed Ranger, but no one held much hope either. Until one early autumn day, a silver SUV pulled up to Hope Trails. And in that moment, something flickered in Ranger's lifeless gaze, just for a second, as a woman walked by. 1 second. For Ranger, it was the first ripple in a lifetime of silence. The woman's name was Elena Riker, a trauma therapist who worked with combat veterans. Her face had seen fear before, had faced panic attacks and guarded eyes that didn't trust light. In 2 decades of practice, Elena had looked into many eyes, but Ranger's, however fleeting, made her stop walking. Beside her was Leah, her 10-year-old daughter with tousled curls and a sketch pad hugged to her chest. They weren't there to adopt or to rescue. This was just a short weekend trip, something quiet to unwind. But not every trip ends the way it's planned. As they walked through the hallway of the rescue center, barks echoed joyfully from excited dogs hoping for attention. All except Ranger. He didn't bark, didn't jump, didn't beg. He just sat silently in the corner of his kennel, his back to the world, like he was punishing himself for still being alive. Elena stopped in front of kennel number 9. She didn't know why. She just did. Leah slowed beside her, her eyes catching the small sign, Ranger, beneath the name, bold warnings, do not approach, dangerous, not suitable for homes with children. Leah didn't finish reading, because that's when Ranger turned his head. His eyes met Elena's. No growl, no bared teeth, just a silent stare that looked numb. But Elena knew better. It wasn't numbness, it was exhausting. He was simply too tired to be afraid. She said nothing. She didn't move closer. She just sat down, far enough not to scare him, close enough to be present. Leah hesitated, then mirrored her mother, knees tucked to her chest, quietly watching. A few staff passed by. One large man walked close, and Ranger's body tensed. A low growl vibrated from his chest. The man quickened his pace without a word. Elena just observed, listening to the story Ranger's body was telling without words. "You see that?" she whispered to Leah. The girl tilted her head, still watching Ranger. "He's not mean," she murmured. "He's just scared." Elena looked at her daughter. Those young eyes had seen pain wrapped in armor before. Maybe it was all those years growing up beside a mother who healed others. Leah hadn't just learned how to see, she had learned how to feel. They stayed that way for a long time. No dramatic moments, no sudden breakthrough. Ranger stayed in his corner, silent. But when Elena stood to leave, he watched her. He didn't turn all the way, just a quiet glance over his shoulder. Then stillness again. That evening, Leah drew a picture. A large dog rested beneath a pine tree. Nearby sat a little girl, not touching, not petting, just close, silent. There was no red, no chains, just two souls sharing a space no longer ruled by fear. "Who's this?" Elena asked, seeing the sketch on the dinner table. "It's not a who, Mom," Leah said softly. "It's a moment when the dog wasn't being chased and didn't have to protect himself anymore." Elena didn't say a word, but in her eyes, and in the quiet that passed between mother and daughter, something had shifted. Ranger was no longer just a dangerous animal labeled unfixable. He had become a question, an unanswered one. And sometimes the questions that matter most are the ones we can't walk away from. The next day, Elena came back, and Ranger looked at her again. Not with pleading, not with that hardened, familiar threat. Just a gaze, steady, unwavering, as if he was asking why the woman had returned, and why she wasn't afraid. Elena brought a book with her, not a psychology manual, not a guide to dog training, just a worn-out novel she had loved as a child. It wasn't about animals, it wasn't about trauma. But there was something in those pages that reminded her. Silence could be its own kind of language. She sat down 3 meters away from Ranger's kennel. No pressure, no signals, no staring. She simply opened the book and began to read, her voice soft, steady, like wind moving gently through trees. Leah sat beside her, quietly pulling colored pencils and paper from her backpack. The Ranger didn't react right away. He remained in the corner, light streaming through the bars, catching every rough edge of his coat, every tiny scar on his ears. He didn't growl, didn't shift, but his eyes were wide open, watching both of them. Leah drew with calm focus. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for direction. She just let her hands follow her heart. When she finished, she rose slowly, moving with the grace of someone entering sacred ground. She knelt at the kennel's edge and gently placed her drawing on the cold concrete floor. She didn't slide it in, didn't push it through the bars, just left it at the threshold and stepped back. The Ranger didn't lunge, didn't growl. He just watched. His eyes paused exactly where the red and blue crayon had drawn a big dog lying under a pine tree. Next to him, a little girl holding a book. No one touching. No one intrudes. But the space between them, closer than before. Elena kept reading. Her voice rose and fell like breathing, anchoring the space, never forcing it. A kind of presence that asked for nothing, offered everything. A staff member walked by and opened their mouth to speak, but Elena raised a single finger, signaling silence. The person hesitated, then quietly stepped away. not because of fear, but because they realized they were witnessing something sacred, something like a ritual. By mid-afternoon, the wind picked up. A golden leaf spun in the breeze, fluttering in front of Ranger's kennel before landing gently, right in the center of Leah's drawing. Ranger blinked. A small motion on a body otherwise still as stone. Then Ranger pushed himself up on his front legs. Not to lunge, not to bark, just to sit up, that was all. But for Elena and Leah, it was the first wave in an ocean waiting to awaken. When they left later that afternoon, Ranger still hadn't touched the drawing. But he didn't turn away. He watched them go. No blinking. No stiffness like before. And that, for a creature who had once been starved, beaten, used as a weapon and thrown away like trash, that was the beginning of trust. On the ride home, Leah looked out the window, her eyes shiny from wind and sun. "Mom," she whispered, I think he remembers my face now." Elena didn't answer right away. She just placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder and smiled. It was a smile filled with hope, but also caution. Because Elena knew beings like Ranger didn't open all at once. They opened in layers, like bandages slowly unwrapped from wounds that hadn't fully healed. But deep down, Elena knew. Today, they had peeled back the first one. The next day, when Elena and Leah returned to Hope Trails, a light autumn rain had begun to fall. The sky was a soft gray, the kind of gentle melancholy that didn't bother Leah one bit. She wore her raincoat neatly, carried her art bag like always, and this time brought along a small plastic box filled with homemade dog biscuits. Elena had told her not to feed Ranger directly, but Leah didn't intend to. She just wanted to place it nearby, as another kind of hello. When the two approached the kennels, Ranger was in his usual corner, but this time he wasn't turned away. His head was up. His dark eyes followed their steps from a distance. A young staff member named Sean was mopping the floor nearby. As he came out of the supply room, he passed Ranger's kennel. Just the movement of a shadow in the wrong direction and the soft click of the kennel's latch shifting under his touch was enough to wake the fury. Ranger launched at the metal door in under a second. His claws scraped loud against the cement, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat. His teeth bared, saliva flew, and his eyes locked with an intensity that could slice through stone. Sean stumbled back, both hands raised by instinct. I didn't mean to," he stammered. Trish, the longtime manager, rushed from the office, waving Sean off before turning toward Elena with a worn-out look of apology. "He's still the same," Trish said, her voice low. "Any deep voice, any heavy footsteps? And he tightens like a bowstring. Almost 4 men already. One was the vet, one new volunteer. The other 2 were visitors, both male." Leah clung gently to her mother's side, fingers brushing Elena's hand. "He's never actually bitten anyone, though, has he?" Elena asked, eyes never leaving Ranger, who was still growling behind the bars. Trish nodded slowly. "Not yet. But he once snapped close enough to graze someone's skin. That's when we added all the warning signs. No touching, no hand feeding, no unlocking unless there are 2 staff present." She looked at Ranger, a mixture of sorrow and frustration softening her face. "We tried sedatives. I tried music therapy. Even brought in a specialist. After 3 weeks, he quit. Said it wasn't behavioral, said it was neurological trauma, damage too deep, said he's beyond repair." Elena said nothing. By now, Ranger had retreated to the back of the kennel, but he didn't lie down. He stood there, body tense, as if still calculating the distance between himself and the man who had just left. The growl had stopped, but his eyes hadn't stopped measuring. Leah stared at him, then asked softly, "Mom, if someone hurt you every time they came near you, and then left you behind, would you act like that too?" Elena looked down at her daughter. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe worse." A quiet pause stretched between them. Leah gave a small nod, then opened her bag and took out a new drawing. It showed a wooden bridge stretched across a gentle river. On one side stood a little girl, on the other, a large dog. Above them, sunlight streamed through clouds, touching the center of the bridge. The girl wasn't moving forward. She wasn't calling out. She was just waiting. Leah placed the drawing carefully on the wet concrete, sliding it just close enough to the kennel door before stepping back. Elena didn't stop her. Trish stayed nearby, face still guarded. But Ranger didn't growl. He glanced down at the picture, studying it as if it was the first time colors had entered his world without threat. His gaze moved back to the mother and daughter. Not trusting. Not yet. But I no longer panicked. Trish let out a soft breath. I've never seen him not react when something's placed that close to his space. Elena nodded slowly. Some things, she said, can't be trained. They have to be waited for. And sometimes, waiting in the right way is the only way a shattered soul begins to realize it hasn't been completely abandoned. On the third day, Leah returned with another drawing. This one showed Ranger lying beneath the pine tree again, with an open book beside him. She didn't explain the image. She simply placed it gently at the kennel's edge, stepped back, and sat down, eyes following every slight movement from the dog behind the steel bars. The Ranger didn't come forward, but he didn't growl. And for them, that was a victory. The only sounds were the soft flutter of turning pages, the gentle scratch of Leah's pencil moving across paper, and the steady breath of a dog who once seemed to have given up on life. That's how the first week passed, without expectation, without pressure, just presence. A quiet presence that didn't try to invade, didn't try to prove anything. By the 8th day, Ranger moved. Not much, but he no longer curled up in the farthest corner of his kennel. Instead, he sat a little closer to the door, close enough to see the details of Leah's face when she smiled, when she sketched, even when she simply sat there, doing nothing at all. Elena said nothing, but when she turned to look at Ranger, her eyes softened, because she understood. Some wounds don't have to be spoken aloud to show they're starting to heal. And some creatures, ones who were taught that the world was a battlefield to survive, were finally relearning their first lesson, that not every presence brings pain. That afternoon, Leah left behind another drawing. In it, Ranger lay beside a sunflower. No fences, no steel bars, just earth, grass, and the soft October light spilling from the sky. She bowed her head gently, as if greeting the character she had drawn. The Ranger looked. He didn't move. But his ears, they didn't fold back like they used to. And Trish, the woman who once thought she understood every dog deemed beyond saving, stood quietly in the back, gripping a folder a little too tightly, because something had shifted, not just in the dog, but in the way people looked at him. Elena sat on the bench behind the center, watching as Leah carefully taped the new picture onto the glass outside Ranger's kennel. It showed Ranger lying beneath the tall pine again, eyes closed, sunlight resting on his body. The picture was shaded in soft, warm colors, and for the first time, there were no chains. Leah stepped back, tilting her head, admiring her work as though whispering something only she could hear. Then she turned to her mother and said, gently but firmly, "I think he needs a family." Elena froze. Her daughter hadn't said it like a child who saw a pitiful animal. She said it with the heart of someone who had witnessed fear, who had lived in silence, who understood what it felt like when something inside your chest was pounding just to be seen, to be safe. Trish, the shelter manager, stepped quietly behind Elena and said in a hushed voice, "I know you're a doctor and experienced, but this is your daughter. Are you sure?" Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at Ranger, now standing near the front of the kennel, eyes tracking Leah's every movement. No growling, no flinching, just watching, a gaze no longer weighed down with panic. "I'm not sure," Elena said honestly, "but I think if anyone's going to give him a chance, it should be us." Trish nodded once. She said nothing more and stepped back. That night, while Leah slept, Elena sat alone in her small office. In front of her were medical files, behavioral reports, and the list of special conditions required by the center for anyone who dared consider adopting Ranger. Every line reads like a warning. Every sheet is a reminder. This was a decision that could put her family's safety at risk. But Elena saw something different. She saw a soul still fighting to exist after its trust had been crushed by human hands. She saw defiance, not as aggression, but as a scream that had never been heard. And at that moment, Elena wasn't a therapist, wasn't a mother weighing pros and cons. She was simply someone who had learned how to listen to the things that couldn't be spoken. Because some souls don't need fixing. They just need someone willing to sit beside them, quietly, without conditions, without force, just to be there. The next morning, Elena returned to Hope Trails with a new folder in her hand. She walked straight to Trish's desk. "I'd like to apply to be a ranger." Outside the glass, Leah was crouched in front of the kennel, reading softly from her favorite book. Her voice was barely louder than the breeze. And Ranger didn't turn away. There was no growling, no retreat, just a slight lift of the ears, a soft tilt of the head, and a slow, almost tentative flick of the tail as it brushed the ground in a motion too gentle to ignore. Elena stood at the edge of the hallway, quietly watching. In her hands was the adoption file, signed, stamped, and complete with every clause the center had requested. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she also knew, if ever there was a right moment to step forward, it was now. Now, when the most guarded soul had cracked open the smallest door to trust. At the far end of the corridor was the boardroom, hidden behind a heavy wooden door and walls lined with photo frames, pictures of dogs once lost, now healed, now home. But none of them looked like Ranger. Inside, 6 people sat around a long table. The head veterinarian, a behavior coordinator, the center director, and 3 members of the community board. They had all read the file, and they all had questions. Elena took her seat, spine straight, eyes steady. She had sat in rooms far more tense than this. But this one felt different, not because of the risk, but because what was on the line was the chance for one life to finally be lived. The first to speak was Dr. Morgan, a silver-haired woman with glasses and a voice that was slow but carried weight. "I see you're a single mother, 10-year-old daughter. Are you certain that bringing a dog with this level of behavioral risk into your home is safe?" Elena responded immediately, without hesitation. "Nothing is certain, but I know how to assess risk, and I'm not applying out of pity. I'm doing this because I see the possibility of recovery, and because my daughter sees something we're all overlooking." Another board member, Mr. Benson, the community representative, folded his hands on the table and leaned in slightly. "You've treated severe PTSD cases. Some of your patients had histories of violence. Why do you believe a dog used as a weapon can change?" Elena didn't flinch. "Because I've seen that look before, in therapy sessions, on the faces of people who thought there was no way back, and every time I've learned something. Anger isn't destruction, it's desperation, when someone has no idea how to be accepted. Ranger is no different. He's not aggressive. He's defensive. It's the only language he was ever taught." Silence filled the room. A few glances exchanged across the table. At the far end sat Trish, the center's longtime manager. Her hands were clasped tightly, but her voice was calm when she spoke. "I've watched Elena and Leah for weeks now. I used to believe Ranger couldn't change, but I've seen him grow quieter when they're near. I saw his eyes the first time Leah placed a drawing at his kennel. He didn't bark, didn't lunge. He just watched. And that's never happened before." Dr. Morgan looked thoughtful, then opened the file again. "We can approve this, but only with strict oversight, weekly reports, behavioral monitoring via video, and if we detect any signs of danger, Ranger returns to the center immediately." Elena nodded. "I accept every condition," Elena said calmly, "but I have one request." All eyes turned toward her. "Please," she said, "stop calling him a danger case. Call him by his name. Call him Ranger." "Ranger is not a problem. He's a chance no one's dared to take." A moment passed. Then one board member raised their hand. Then a second. The third hesitated, then slowly nodded. And with a narrow vote, Elena was approved. As she stepped out of the boardroom, Leah was already waiting in the hallway, her eyes bright with quiet knowing. "Mom?" Elena nodded, knelt down, and wrapped her daughter in her arms. "We're bringing him home." Leah didn't speak. She simply held her mother's hand, tight, like she had known this moment would come all along. And in her eyes, there was something deeper than hope, a kind of still, radiant belief. Quiet, but so powerful it sent a chill down Trish's spine, the kind of chill only truth could bring. The boardroom door hadn't even fully closed when one of the council members called out again. The question wasn't in any form. It wasn't part of any protocol. It came from a place he couldn't fully explain. "Elena? Why him? With that history? With that risk? Why choose the one everyone else gave up on?" Elena turned back. She didn't look away. "I didn't choose Ranger because I think I can change him. I chose him because I believe no one should be defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to them." The man nodded slowly, as if hearing something he hadn't dared to believe before. Elena didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her final words were spoken quietly, but with a clarity that brought the entire room to stillness. "I'm not afraid of the dark. I understand it." The door closed behind her. Trish stood waiting in the hallway. She didn't beam with joy or offer flowery words. She simply nodded, then gestured toward the back kennels. The Ranger was still lying there. Still. Silent, but his ears moved. As if he'd heard something important. And in that moment, Trish tilted her head slightly and whispered, barely believing her own voice. "That little girl made him quiet, for the first time." Elena paused. Leah looked up, her eyes shining, then turned to Ranger. She didn't run. She didn't reach for him. She simply stood tall, her posture saying everything. "I'm here." And strangely, the Ranger didn't look away. He didn't come forward. But he didn't retreat to the back of the kennel either. He just watched. A little longer, a little deeper. Then he exhaled. A breath so soft you might have missed it if you weren't paying attention. But Trish noticed. It wasn't a growl. It was the letting go, just a little, of the invisible armor he'd worn for so long. That night, back at home, Elena couldn't sleep. She made a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the porch. Leah was sound asleep, clutching her old teddy bear, her face still glowing with quiet joy. Elena wondered if she was being reckless, if she was putting her daughter at risk for the sake of one dog who'd been through too much. But then she remembered something an old colleague once said at a trauma recovery shelter. The things we call risks are sometimes the only things that save someone else. Elena sat down and opened Ranger's file again, page after page of behavior assessments, medical reports, warnings in bold red ink. But through it all, her mind kept returning to something that wasn't on any page. The way Ranger looked at Leah, not angry, not afraid, just waiting. And at that moment, Elena closed the folder. She didn't need to read more. Because tomorrow they will begin a new chapter, not with a plan, but with belief. Early the next morning, Montana greeted the day with a thin veil of mist draped across its open fields. The air was crisp, clear, and the sky stretched wide like it was waiting for something peaceful to begin. Elena's silver SUV rolled into Hope Trails just as the first golden light spilled onto the grass. Leah sat in the back seat, holding a small satchel filled with drawing paper, colored pencils, and a notebook she called her healing journal. Trish was waiting at the door. No one spoke much. There was no need. Everyone understood this wasn't just another morning. Not for Ranger. Not for anyone who had ever seen that dog snarl, recoil, or disappear behind a fortress of steel and fear. Ranger was still in his kennel, like always. But today, his eyes were different, not full of trust, but be aware that something was shifting. Elena and Leah stood a few steps away, not calling, not coaxing. They opened the SUV's back hatch. Inside was a thick, padded blanket and a worn old quilt laid neatly across the space. Trish gently placed some of Ranger's favorite food on a cloth nearby, then stepped back. 10 minutes passed. No words. 20. Still nothing. 35 minutes. Leah sat on the concrete step and opened her sketchbook. Her pencil moved slowly across the page, tracing the outline of a familiar shape. Tall ears, dark eyes, and a gaze that always seemed to see straight through you. At minute 42, the Ranger moved. He stood, not quickly, but with the careful tension of someone testing each stone in a bridge they weren't sure would hold. Step by step, slow and deliberate, Ranger moved forward. He didn't look at anyone, but each paw placed was a question. Is it safe? Will someone raise a hand? No hand was raised. Just Leah, head bowed, drawing. Just Elena, still and steady. Just Trish, holding her breath. And then, Ranger stepped in. Gently, quietly. His body was taut, coiled like a wire stretched too far. But he lay down inside the SUV, atop the quilt, without a growl, without a whimper. Just one long breath. The door closed behind him, not like a trap, but like the quiet start of something new. Elena turned to Trish and gave a simple nod, the kind of thank you that needed no words. Trish touched her shoulder, her voice almost breaking. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe he didn't need fixing. Maybe he just needed someone to believe in him. The SUV pulled away from Hope Trails. Leah sat in the back seat, her sketchbook resting on her lap. On the page she had just finished, 2 silhouettes sat beneath a tall pine. One girl, one dog. Not touching, but side by side, facing forward. No leash, no fence. Just enough space to not hurt each other. And close enough to know. Neither was alone anymore. Elena glanced into the rearview mirror. Ranger was panting, eyes wide and fixed on the passing window. But his body didn't curl in fear. There was no growl, no flinch, only watching, not panic. Lust. Caution. A caution that still lived inside him, but no longer wanted to harm anyone. As the car turned onto the slope leading into town, Leah whispered. Maybe to herself, maybe to the wind, or maybe to the tired soul resting in the back. You don't have to change, Ranger. You just need to know. You don't have to be scared alone anymore. Elena reached for her daughter's hand. She didn't squeeze, just touched it. And in the quiet, shadowed space inside the SUV, Ranger blinked once. A beginning. Not grand. Not glorious. But real. Ranger's first room was quiet. No loud noises, no TV, no ringing phones, no voices calling out his name. Elena had prepared it with the care of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with hearts that didn't bleed, but still broke. In one corner sat a small pinewood bed with a soft, ash-gray blanket. Beside it, a simple rug, not too thick, just enough for Ranger to lie down without slipping or panicking. There were no open windows, no bright, dangling lights, just the warm glow of a low bedside lamp, soft as candlelight, soft as breath. Leah didn't say a word. She stood in the doorway, hands tucked behind her back, then looked up at her mother. Elena gave a small nod. Leah stepped aside, giving space. Ranger stepped in like he wasn't sure whether this was a dream or another nightmare dressed in quieter clothing. Each paw landed cautiously, his gaze scanning every corner but never lingering too long. And finally, he sat. Not in the bed. Not on the rug Elena had picked, but in the far corner, pressed against the wall, where no one could come up behind him. Elena didn't follow. She stood at the doorway, quietly watching. Leah had already sunk to the floor outside, sketching silently on a fresh white page. That first dinner was placed about 3 steps away, close enough to say, "We're here," but far enough to not feel forced. Ranger didn't eat. He just watched. Then lowered his head onto his front paws, eyes open, ears alert. Elena recognized the signal. It wasn't refusal. It was a body that didn't yet believe it was safe enough to digest. That night the Ranger didn't move. Didn't howl. Didn't whine. I didn't sleep. Every time Elena passed by in the dark, his eyes were still open, just slightly clouded, like he was willing himself to stay awake, just to survive. But he didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't resist. And to Elena, that wasn't failure. It was the first flicker of a soul that hadn't fully shattered. The next morning, soft Montana light spilled through the frosted hallway glass. Leah woke up earlier than usual. She didn't ask questions, didn't speak. Just pulled her box of colored pencils from her backpack, slid a blank page from her desk drawer, and sat on the floor. The first drawing was of a large brown dog with wide, watchful eyes, lying under a pine tree. Beside him, a little girl with brown hair, not touching, just sitting there, looking at the sky. Leah carefully taped the drawing to the small wall next to Ranger's food bowl. She didn't make him look at it, didn't try to explain. She just left it there, like a whispered message with no sound. "I see you, and I'm waiting." The Ranger glanced at it, didn't move closer, but didn't turn away. He lay still, eyes quiet, like he was storing something inside. Day 2, Leah drew again. A small sun and a wind-blown tree. The picture went next to the water bowl. "So he knows," Leah whispered when Elena asked, "that someone's waiting." Elena didn't stop her. She simply looked at Ranger, then at her daughter, and saw something eerily alike between them. A patience that didn't ask for rewards. By day 5, Ranger ate with both of them still in the room. Not quickly, not nervously. He just lowered his head and took a few bites, his eyes fixed in one direction, toward the door. But he didn't shake. Leah didn't rush to pet him, She only smiled, softly, lightly, like she didn't want the air to notice. Then she stepped outside and left another drawing. This one had two silhouettes, one human, one canine, standing beside a creek. The sun no longer stood alone. Each morning she left a piece of paper near his food, like she was planting hope in ground that hadn't bloomed yet. And Ranger never replied. But he stayed. And he looked. He looked long enough for trust to start growing roots. On the third night, Elena stirred from a restless sleep and heard something. Soft footsteps brushing the hallway floor. No growl, no click of claws, just a breath. Even. Slow. Ranger stood outside Leah's bedroom door. Not inside. Just there. Like a shadow that no longer haunted, but brought something gentler. Lighter. The next morning he didn't wait for them to leave the room. Ranger walked to his bowl, lowered his head, and ate bite by bite, calm, unhurried, no longer scanning the door. Elena stayed where she was, in the armchair, hands resting on her knees. Leah sat beside her, wide-eyed, unmoving. She didn't laugh. She didn't clap. She simply extended a hand. Not too close, but close enough for Ranger to see. And then, a blink. Not a quick, nervous blink. A slow one. The kind of blink animal behaviorists call a silent hello, a sign of trust. Elena placed her hand gently on Leah's shoulder. "You see that?" she whispered. "He's talking to us now." Leah didn't reply. But in her eyes, something had opened. Like a dream she had drawn 100 times was now, quietly, stepping into real life. And for a dog who once embodied nothing but fear, one blink, just one, was enough to change the entire world. That night, the wind howled colder than usual. The tin roof of their little home shuddered as gusts whipped through the pine trees like whispers from something long buried. Elena was making tea in the kitchen. Leah lay curled on the sofa, reading a comic book about animals with extraordinary abilities. Ranger rested at the far end of the living room, eyes quietly locked on the window as always. Watchful, but no longer panicked. Then came the knock. Not the gentle tap of a familiar neighbor, but urgent, repetitive, like someone in a hurry or someone trying to intimidate. Elena froze. The teacup tilted in her hand, spilling hot water across the back of her skin, but she didn't flinch. Leah lifted her head, her eyes wide. The doorknob turned. A dry click echoed through the house, slicing clean through the quiet. Someone was trying to come in. Before Elena could speak, before she could move, a shadow bolted down the hallway. Ranger. He didn't bark. He didn't growl like the violent dogs you see on warning signs. He just moved, fast, decisive, deliberate, and stopped right in front of the door. His body is broad and still, planted like a living shield. No noise, only presence. Ranger stood angled forward, ears high, shoulders tensed, ready to absorb anything that might come crashing through. No growling, no snarling, just a silence stretched so tight it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. Elena reached behind her, slowly pulling Leah back. She didn't call Ranger's name, didn't give him a command. She only spoke softly, her voice calm. "Please leave the package at the door. We'll get it later." A pause, thick with tension, then footsteps retreating. The door stayed shut. No package was left behind. Just Ranger. Still there. Still silent. Like a statue carved from loyalty and vigilance. Leah looked up at her mother. Ranger didn't retreat to his corner. He stayed. For the first time. For the very first time. The ranger didn't run from fear. He rose, to face it, to protect. Not because he'd been trained to, not because someone gave him a command, not even because some deep instinct of the old violent world told him to, but because Elena and Leah were behind him, and he no longer wanted to hide behind the hurt. Elena watched him for a long moment. The lamplight spilled across Ranger's scarred brown and black coat, casting shadows that made his frame seem larger, more grounded. His chest moved with steady breaths, not in fear, but in readiness. Then he turned his head, not to retreat, but to walk toward them, not too close, no wagging tail. But Ranger had chosen to stay in the center of the room, in the light, in space once too terrifying to exist within. He chose presence. He chose people. He chose the middle of a world that, just 8 months ago, had looked like hell. Leah slowly sat down on the floor, cross-legged. Elena hadn't told her to. She just did it. Like she knew. Silence was the most beautiful thank you they could offer. The ranger stood a moment longer, then carefully lowered himself to the floor, still watching the door. Ears still alert, but his body is no longer tight with fear. A small sign, but the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Elena took one slow step forward. The ranger didn't pull away. She sat down beside Leah. 3 figures, a mother, a 10-year-old girl, and a dog once written off as hopeless, sat together in the same space for the first time, with no barriers. No one spoke, but they all understood. The sound of the doorbell would no longer mean danger. It would become a symbol of trust. Tomorrow Elena would hang a small bell from the back door handle, so that if Ranger ever wanted to go outside, he wouldn't have to circle the room in anxious silence. He would just need to touch it, gently. And her daughter Leah would teach him how, with her eyes, with her sketches, with the kind of love that's quieter, deeper, and far more powerful than anything a training manual could offer. That night, Ranger didn't retreat to his corner. He stayed, right there, in the middle of the room, eyes closed, ears are still listening, but his body had learned to soften. And Elena knew when a creature who once flinched at every shadow learns to lie down without fear. That's not just rest, that's healing. Later that afternoon, Leah carefully tied a small bell to a strip of soft cloth and hung it beside the wooden back door. Not too loud, not too sharp. Just a soft chime, like wind weaving through pine needles. She turned to Ranger, squinting with a smile. "If you want to go somewhere," she said gently, "you just have to let us know." The ranger didn't approach right away, but his ears twitched. A small reaction like a compass needle, just beginning to shift. That evening, when the house had quieted, Ranger didn't curl into his usual corner. Instead, he rose and walked, slowly, toward the door. Elena sat up, silently, just watching. Leah watched, too, hugging her pillow, wide-eyed and waiting. Ranger lowered his head and tapped his nose against the strip of cloth. Chime. The softest sound, but it shattered a silence that had lasted far too long. Elena got up and opened the door. Ranger stepped out into the yard, inhaling the crisp night air. Then he turned, looked back, eyes clear beneath the porch light. No growling, no hesitation. Just a dog learning how to say, "I want to go out, and I believe I'm allowed." Before bed, Leah drew one more picture. This time, it was a door slightly open, a bell softly ringing, and Ranger standing in the threshold as if he had just stepped across the line he once believed he could never cross. The sheet of paper was placed carefully on the dining table, beside a bowl of warm water sweetened with honey, Elena's remedy for Leah's raspy throat. A soft yellow light spilled gently across the unfinished pencil lines, casting a quiet reverence over a drawing that wasn't quite complete, yet already full of emotion. The next morning, Ranger sat nearby. Not too close, but close enough to see Leah shading the sky a light blue. Elena passed by, paused for a second, then continued to pour her coffee. No one spoke. No one gave commands. No one said, "Sit," or "Come," or "Good boy." But Ranger stayed. That afternoon, Leah worked on her homework atop a small rug by the window. Ranger lay just under 2 meters away. He wasn't curled tight. He didn't glance around. He just existed, as gently as autumn wind brushing through open fields. Leah softly read a math problem aloud, then whispered to herself, "If I were him, I'd need time too." Elena sat beside her, voice calm and low. "You know he doesn't speak like we do, right?" Leah nodded. Elena pointed gently. "When his ears fold back like that, it means he's unsure. If his tail gives a little wag, that's curiosity. And when he sighs, that's him learning to relax. You see, his language is in his body, not his mouth." Leah looked up. "So, we have to listen. With our eyes?" Elena smiled. "Yes, that's what it means to respect fear. Not everyone's ready to tell their story. But when they do, even with a glance or a breath, we need to be there to hear it." Across the room, Ranger lifted his head. His gaze swept over the mother and daughter, slowly, deeply, but without the edge of self-defense. Leah didn't look away. She gently reached for more color and continued drawing a little field behind the bell from her unfinished piece. A breeze moved through the curtains. The scent of something baking drifted through the house. The three of them, a woman, a little girl, and a dog who had lived too long in the dark, shared a space together. No need to explain. No need to understand everything at once. But somehow, they were learning to hear the quiet things inside each other. And sometimes, that's the only kind of healing that works. A presence that speaks not through words, but through empathy. That morning, snow fell heavier than usual. The sky turned a soft gray, blanketing the distant pines in gentle white. Elena, bundled in her olive-green coat with frayed edges, wrapped an arm around Leah and looked toward Ranger, resting on the rug, head between his paws, eyes half closed. He opened them as Elena called softly. No growl, no recoil, just a quiet rise to his feet, a walk to the door, and a pause. Leah giggled, not because Ranger did anything spectacular, but because he had repeated something small, a signal. He was ready. Ready to believe the world outside that door was no longer a trap. 3 shadows, one tall, one small, one padded with fur, walked slowly along the forest path. The sound of snow compressing beneath boots and paws whispered like a conversation with the earth. Leah talked about her dream, how she and Ranger were sitting on Mars. Elena laughed, encouraging her with questions about oxygen and gravity. A ranger walked between them, ears alert, tail swaying. Cautious, yes, but no longer stiff with fear. They turned onto a narrow trail toward the thicker pines. It was one of Elena's favorite places to let Ranger breathe in the scent of wilderness, to hear the trees creak under snow, to replace the harsh sounds of his past with something gentler. Leah bent to pick up a fallen pine branch, ready to draw in the snow. But Ranger stopped, abruptly. His ears shot up, nose drops. His body tensed. Not like a pet, but like a creature who had once hunted, or been hunted. Elena gripped Leah's hand, pulling her close. Her voice dropped, steady, not afraid. "What is it?" Ranger didn't bark, didn't growl. He crept forward, step by slow step, then broke into a sprint. "Ranger!" Elena shouted, boots slipping on ice as she ran. Leah followed, not even registering fear, only instinct. Go after him. 2 turns, a low patch of woods. And there he was, frozen in place. In front of him lay a man, young, sprawled in the snow, eyes shut, lips blue. Next to him, a toppled backpack, strap twisted. Elena dropped to her knees, fingers searching for a pulse at his wrist. It was faint, but it was there. And his breath, barely more than fog. "He fell," Leah whispered, her hand trembling on Elena's shoulder. Elena nodded. "Slipped, maybe. Sprained ankle, hypothermia." She pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the local emergency number. Her voice was steady but fast, giving coordinates and condition updates, while her other hand hovered near Leah's shoulder. Meanwhile, the ranger did not move. He stood firm, a living statue, silent, watching. Every now and then, he would lower his head to sniff the unconscious man's arm, then lift his gaze again, ears perked, alert for the sound of incoming engines. "When the team gets here, the ranger might react." Elena began to warn, but she stopped. The ranger looked at her. Not with fear, not with the waiting for command look of a trained dog, but as an equal, a companion, a soldier checking in with his partner. When the 3 rescue trucks arrived, men in heavy jackets, boots crunching on snow, voices loud and urgent, Elena stepped in front of them and placed a calm hand on Ranger's neck. "It's okay. They're friends," she whispered. Ranger hesitated. Just a beat, but he didn't growl, didn't back away. He stayed rooted, eyes locked on every movement as they lifted the man onto the stretcher. Only after the injured hiker was safely inside the ambulance did Ranger exhale. A slow, deep breath. His head dipped, as if something ancient inside him had just completed itself. That night, the crackling of the wood stove cast warm flickers across the walls. Leah was coloring again. This time the drawing was clear. A snow-covered forest. Ranger curled beside a stranger, his eyes no longer sharp with fear. Instead, they said, "I was once left behind, but I won't do that to anyone else." Elena sat beside her, gently stroking her daughter's back. Then she looked across the room. The ranger was there, not in a corner. Close. He turned his head when their eyes met. No tail wagging, no dramatic gesture. He didn't need one, because the most important things had already been said. Through action, through presence, through the choice to save, not flee. And that kind of decision? No one can train it. You have to choose it. Later that evening, with the scent of melted snow and pine still clinging to the house, Elena checked her email like she always did before bed. The top headline stopped her breath for a second. Dog rescues hiker in freezing forest. Ranger's story shakes social media. It was from the rescue team. A simple post, no edits, no embellishment, just truth. And within that truth, transformation. Awakening. And a trust that wasn't trained, but healed. The first photo showed Ranger lying beside the fallen man, one paw firmly planted in the snow. Unmoving. Unshaken. The second? Ranger standing slightly in front of Elena as the rescue team approached. Not blocking. Not snarling. Just watching. He wasn't a cornered animal anymore. He was a protector. A soul who now knew how to tell danger from help. The comments rolled in. Raw, tender. I gave up on aggressive dogs, not anymore. My son came back from Afghanistan with PTSD. I see him in Ranger. Thank you, Riker family. Only someone who's broken inside can recognize a soul that's shattered. Elena read every word, slowly. Leah sat quietly nearby, sketching like always. But tonight, she didn't keep the drawing to herself. She slid it across the table. At the top, in careful handwriting, he chose to stay. And below it, Ranger. Not curled up, not hiding, standing tall, in a white field of snow, a quiet anchor in a world that had just been reminded what it meant to hope. Elena turned to her daughter. They didn't speak. Leah just nodded. Because everything that needed to be said had already been drawn with the heart. And every wound, if listened to the right way, will always find its way back home. The next morning, as Elena brewed coffee in the fog-draped kitchen, a soft ding sounded from her laptop on the table. A new email had arrived. The subject line was simple, but it stopped her hand mid-stir. Hope Trails, regarding Ranger. Elena opened it. The message was brief but more sincere than anything she had ever received from the center. We owe you an apology for seeing Ranger as a case file, a behavior report, a red-tagged liability, and not as a soul trying to find its way back to itself. Below that was an invitation. Hope Trails was hosting a special gathering for potential adopters, specifically those hesitant about dogs labeled behavioral risks. They wanted Elena and Leah to return, with Ranger, not to prove anything, but simply to be present, to stand as quiet, living proof that what seems impossible can become real if someone waits long enough, deep enough, and real enough. Elena reread the final line, written in Trish's own hand. I was wrong about Ranger, and if he can change, then I believe others, human or canine, deserve a second chance too. Outside on the porch, Leah sat with Ranger curled against her legs. In her hand was a small card, her first card, since this journey began. On it, she had written, I don't know what you'll do next, but I know this. Any place where someone waits patiently for a soul to be itself, that place can be called home. Elena stepped outside and sat beside her daughter. You want to go back? Leah nodded. No hesitation. Not to boast, not to be heroes, but to remind those still uncertain that every wound, as long as it still breathes, can come back to life. And Ranger, the dog once surrounded by red warning labels, was now fast asleep against Leah's lap. Daylight sleep. The kind only those who've lived with fear can understand. Because sleeping in daylight is a declaration, a whisper. I'm safe now, and safety is the beginning of every new story. That morning, the sun rose gently over the thin snow dusting Montana's hills. Elena drove slowly, her hands steady on the wheel like she had learned to be through years of therapy work. Leah sat beside her, not clutching books or toys like usual. Only one thing in her hands, a folded drawing. Inside was a simple scene. 3 figures, a mother, a child, a dog, standing before an iron fence. But this time, the gate was open. The gate at Hope Trails creaked open with its familiar rusty groan. Ranger stepped down from the car without being called. No backing away, no glancing side to side, just one look at Elena, at Leah. A look that asked, "Can I?" A look that trusted the answer would be yes. Then Ranger stepped forward. The scent inside the building was the same disinfectant, old food, and rust. But the silence was different. People who once passed his kennel with downcast eyes now stood still, wide-eyed. Trish was the first to move, still in her morning uniform, scrubs smudged, gloves on. She didn't speak, just placed a hand over her chest as if her heart had forgotten its rhythm for a second. Behind her, a former staff member whispered, "I can't believe that's the same dog." Ranger didn't wag his tail. He didn't have to, because he wasn't returning to the past. He was walking through it, like someone once caged, now walking back not to relive but to bear witness. I survived. Leah reached out her hand, not touching, just placing it gently near Ranger's side, like she had done that very first day by the kennel bars. The Ranger didn't turn away, and for the first time, in a space that used to be his prison, he lay down. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. No words were needed, no speeches, no behavior charts, just a deep exhale, a small hand nearby, and a door that used to be shut. Now wide open, hingeless, proving one thing: trust, no matter how many times it shatters, can be mended. And love, when persistent enough, can undo even the most stubborn fears. In a quiet, sunlit room at the back of the center, Elena stood before a small podium. Behind her, Leah sat calmly beside Ranger, his head resting across her knees as if the busy room around them simply didn't exist. Elena scanned the audience: prospective adopters, former staff, some who had once whispered caution into every folder marked aggressive. She began. "I didn't train Ranger," she said softly. "I just showed him this place was safe. I didn't command, I didn't force. I just stayed. Quiet, like a light in a room gone dark. And one day, he stepped out of the shadow on his own." No one moved. They weren't just listening. They were feeling. Elena continued, her voice not loud, not showy, but steady, warm, and rooted in something deeper than authority. "I've worked with many people carrying wounds no one can see," she said. "They don't scream for help. They just retreat into corners and pray someone won't give up on them. Ranger was no different." Her eyes scanned the room, kind but unflinching. "And today, I don't want you to see him as a miracle story. I want you to see him as proof that sometimes, to help a soul open its door, you don't need to knock harder. You just need to wait on the steps long enough." From the middle rows, a young woman raised her hand, voice trembling. "I have a dog who reacts badly to men. Everyone tells me to give up, that she'll never change." She choked back her breath. "But seeing Ranger today, I'm starting to think maybe I just haven't waited long enough." Leah lifted her head. Her gaze carried something luminous, something stronger than her 10 years. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I used to think dogs only needed love," Leah said. "But now I know. They need patience, too. And someone who listens." Ranger didn't change because anyone forced him. He changed because someone waited long enough for him to believe he was worth trusting again. The room fell silent. But it wasn't the awkward silence of people unsure what to say. It was the sacred kind, the silence that follows something real settling into the hearts of everyone listening. And right then, Ranger lifted his head, slowly, gently, and rested it on Leah's arm. There was no sound, no applause, no commands, but every person in the room felt it. The softest ending to the deepest lesson one no book could teach. A few days later, as winter slowly stepped back to let the first touches of spring sunlight peek through the bare branches, Elena began hanging the first photos on the wall across from her desk. They weren't artistic photos. Some were blurry, others cut off halfway, hands clearly shaking as they were taken. But to her, they were irreplaceable moments. The first photo showed the day Ranger stepped into their home. Not because he was commanded, but because he chose to. In the image, he stood at the threshold, body tense, eyes locked onto Elena and Leah as if to ask, "Is this real?" Next to it was a picture of Leah sitting on the floor doing her homework, while Ranger lay nearby, his head tilted slightly, ears perked up as though he were listening. Elena called that the first lesson in co-presence. Being there, but never intruding. Then came the photo of Ranger standing firm at the front door after that night of strange noises. No intruder came. But that didn't matter. Because that night, no one had to call. No one asked for protection. And yet, a living being had chosen to stand guard. Not out of instinct, but out of will. Elena placed that photo in the center. Beneath it, in her handwriting, she wrote, "No one taught him. He simply chose." Beside those photos hung a small certificate framed in pale blue. It read, "Awarded to Leah Riker, Behavior Recovery Assistant, in recognition of her role in the rehabilitation journey of Rescue Dog Ranger." When Leah received the certificate, she didn't laugh or cheer like most kids might. She just glanced at her mom, then turned to Ranger, who was sitting nearby, and handed him the paper gently, as if to say, "This belongs to us both." Elena would never forget that moment, not because of the paper, but because of the way Ranger, who once flinched at any beam of light, looked directly at Leah. No growling, no hesitation. She let out a quiet breath. Not because everything was perfect, but because even the deepest cracks now had somewhere to begin healing. And that wall with its imperfect snapshots, tilted smiles, and quiet eyes had become something like the heart of the house. A heart that remembered. A heart that revived. And most importantly, a heart that loved without needing anything in return. The Ranger no longer stayed hidden in corners, no longer pressed his body to the wall like air itself was something to be feared. He had started moving not because he was pulled, but because he wanted to. Quietly trailing behind Elena from room to room, still cautious, but no longer haunted. In the mornings, he waited outside Leah's bedroom door. No scratching, no whining, just lying there. And when the door opened, Ranger stepped in not to find a hiding spot, but to settle down right in the sunbeam, spilling across the floor. Leah would lay a soft blanket beside her desk so she could glance over and see Ranger resting peacefully. She no longer needed to check for flinching footsteps or fearful panting. In the kitchen, when Elena prepared meals, Ranger no longer backed away when she opened a drawer. He simply raised his head, tilted it, curious, not afraid. And by evening, when all three sat by the fireplace, Ranger no longer kept a wide distance. He curled near Leah's feet, ears relaxed against the rug, eyes shut in a rare, deep sleep. This wasn't a submission. It was companionship. Elena sat once more by the window, red pen in hand, noting a new entry in Ranger's recovery journal, not about behavior, but emotion. A dog once labeled dangerous had become part of a family's rhythm. No one said the word training anymore, because no one was trying to change the Ranger. They were simply walking with him. On the wall, Leah had just taped up a new drawing. A simple scene, a girl doing her homework, Ranger lying close by, and Elena reading in the background. No one hugging, no commands, just a quiet kind of belonging. Ranger was no longer a shadow in the corner. He had become a quiet light guiding souls that had once lived in darkness. By the fireplace, as Montana's evening wrapped the world in a snowy hush, Elena sat with a warm cup of tea in her hands. Leah rested her head on her mother's knee, drawing in a fresh notebook. And Ranger lay between them, chest rising and falling slowly, caught in a rare, deep sleep, the kind only known by those who have finally realized they no longer have to keep guard. No one spoke, only the soft glide of pencil on paper, and the steady breath of a soul once thought to be broken. Elena set her teacup down and stared at Ranger for a long while. In the soft glow of the fireplace, his fur seemed fuller now, the burned amber streaks along his back glowing gently like polished pine wood. But it wasn't his appearance that moved her most. It was the stillness, the quiet presence. Not because he was trying to prove anything, but because for once he didn't have to. She whispered, almost like a prayer meant only for him. You don't have to become anyone else. Just be you. And live. No one had asked Ranger to be cheerful. No one forced him to be friendly. They had simply waited. Patiently. Like someone waiting for a late-season breeze to slip through a doorframe without shattering the morning light. And maybe that was what saved him. Not commands, not techniques, but unconditional acceptance. The next morning, Elena found a small piece of paper taped to the wall. Leah had written in purple marker, the letters a little wobbly but heartbreakingly sincere. No one's really broken. They're just learning how to heal. Elena folded the note and tucked it into a tin box filled with little memories, the ones worth keeping close. Each day with Ranger now felt like another patch sewn onto a tattered armor of trust. He hadn't forgotten his past. But he wasn't drowning in it anymore either. He was living. Truly living. Like someone who had walked through fire and smoke not to tell stories of survival, but to quietly guide others through the same storm. And that is how memories heal. Not by being erased, but by writing a new chapter, one softer, one kinder, and true to the very last word. The apple tree behind the house had started to bloom. Tiny white buds peeked out from a thick layer of green, signaling that spring had returned. Not just to the frozen earth, but to the hearts that had weathered it too. That afternoon, the sky was as clear as glass. The wind brushed against their cheeks, carrying the scent of fresh soil and the delicate perfume of apple blossoms. Elena spread out a small blanket on the lawn. Leah curled into her mother's arms. And beside them, Ranger, the dog once feared in every behavioral report, lay on his side, eyes closed, one ear twitching to the bird song above. No one spoke, and no one needed to. Because true peace doesn't have to be named. It simply exists, woven into steady breaths, into a grateful glance from Leah to Ranger, returned with a quiet flick of his gaze that seemed to say, "We're right where we belong." Overhead, a blossom floated down and landed softly on Ranger's back. He didn't shake it off. He didn't rise. He just lay there, still, as if agreeing with everything that had come to pass. Elena gave her daughter's hand a gentle squeeze. "We made it," she whispered. "Through winter, through the nights, through the growls. Now it's time to live." Leah nodded faintly. She sat up, reached into her worn fabric pouch, and pulled out her sketchbook, its corners frayed with time. With pencil strokes fine as hair, she began to capture the scene before her. Not with flair, not with embellishment, but with the soft truth of what was. At the heart of the drawing was a single apple tree. Not the tallest, not the prettiest, but its branches stretched wide, as if cradling 3 small lives beneath its bloom. A mother, a child, and a dog. No bold outlines, no separation, just shapes melting into one another, as if they'd belonged together long before pencil met paper. Leah looked up and met Ranger's eyes from a short distance away. His eyes were open, but he didn't move. When their eyes met, she smiled. Not the smile of victory, but a quiet thank you for presence, for trust, for choosing to stay. In the bottom corner of the page, she wrote a single word: home. Elena didn't speak when Leah handed her the drawing. She just looked for a long time, then placed a hand gently on her daughter's back. "You didn't just draw a picture," she said softly. "You drew the journey." From a cold steel kennel in Montana. from a dog once thought unchangeable, from fears that once hid in every half-bite, every desperate attempt to disappear into shadow. And now, here they were, beneath a blooming apple tree, in the gentlest sunlight spring could offer. Ranger tilted his head slightly and sniffed the breeze, and Elena understood. He could smell something deeper than calm. The word on that sketch wasn't just a name. It was a vow that no matter how jagged the past, every creature deserves a place to belong. A promise not spoken, but drawn, in a glance held too long to be cautious, in a body that dared to lie down without flinching, in those first quiet steps out of the darkness without ever looking back. The story of Ranger drifted beyond Hope Trails, like petals caught in the wind. Local news outlets began covering his journey. A radio station invited Elena to speak about the quiet transformation they had all witnessed. Leah's drawing, titled Home, was shared thousands of times online, captioned with just one simple sentence: "Don't call them broken dogs, call them souls waiting to be healed." Soon after, Hope Trails, once the place that had taped a "Do Not Approach" sign on Ranger's kennel, launched a brand new program. They named it Recovery Without Judgment. On a soft Friday morning, Elena and Leah were invited back for the launch event. Ranger walked beside them, calm and unhurried down the stone path leading into the main hall. No leash, just quiet companionship. One staff member, who had once witnessed Ranger's snarls and bared teeth, froze in place when they saw him now. Serene, self-contained, moving as if each stone beneath him had been carefully chosen in advance. During the ceremony, the center's director spoke. "We were afraid of him once," she admitted. "And then, we learned to listen." A very specific kind of silence swept through the room. Elena didn't give a speech. Neither did Leah. They simply stood together, like they had under the apple tree that afternoon. No need to explain, because anyone who has ever been afraid knows. The most important truths often live beyond words. Just a few days later, over 30 volunteers had signed up for Recovery Without Judgment. They all wrote the same reason on their applications: "Because I believe every being, even human, deserves one more chance to begin again." And Ranger, the dog once deemed unadoptable, had become the symbol of that belief. Not through miracles, but through something far simpler. The understanding that some wounds don't need fixing. Just a little more time to stay, and they'll know how to heal. On an early summer morning, Elena stood on the stage of the National Rescue Conference, facing hundreds of staff members, volunteers, and specialists from across the country. Down in the front row sat Leah, one hand resting gently on Ranger's back. Ranger, who lay still, his head on her lap, eyes half closed, as if listening not with ears, but with heart. Elena didn't bring a speech. She brought a single drawing. It was a simple picture of 3 figures from behind: a mother, a child, and a dog, seated beneath an apple tree in full bloom. The sky above them was scattered with white blossoms. In the bottom corner, barely visible, were 5 handwritten words: "No one is ever hopeless." Elena held the drawing up. Then she began to speak, not as a professional, but as someone who had once witnessed something the world might have called impossible. "I'm not here to share a method," she said softly. "I'm not speaking today as a therapist. I'm here as a mother, as someone who believes that sometimes the best thing you can do for a wounded soul is to sit beside it. No expectations, no pressure, just be there, quiet, present." Rangers didn't need to be trained. He needed someone patient enough to wait. And I believe that every shelter, every foster home, every family, if they can shift from fear to understanding, from control to connection, can become a place where healing begins. No one needs to start over. They just need to keep going, with a hand that reaches out at the right time. The room fell still. A few people wiped away tears. Others squeezed their hands beside them. Elena bowed deeply, then stepped off the stage, leaving behind the drawing on the podium, like a silent offering. Let those who were once forgotten. I know we still remember them. That afternoon, when they got home, Leah didn't nap. She opened her old, scuffed laptop, the one Elena had given her on her last birthday, and began typing. Not a diary, not a school essay. But letters. Letters for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "I'll tell Ranger's story," she typed, "so others like him out there know they're not alone." She called the blog Whispers of Hope, a gentle online space where Leah wrote short stories about abandoned dogs, cats behind chain-link fences, and birds who had been freed, but still didn't dare fly too far. Because in the world of wounds, sometimes flying isn't instinct. Sometimes it's something you have to relearn. Each night before bed, Leah read one of her stories aloud to Ranger. He would lie still, paws tucked, eyes half closed, but Elena knew he was listening. Every time Leah said his name, Ranger would lift his head just a little, not barking, not reacting, just listening, quietly, completely. Soon, letters from readers began arriving. Some were adults who had once loved pets but had to let them go. Others came from children, sharing photos of dogs they'd just adopted from local shelters, along with trembling handwriting that said, "I promise I'll be patient with him." And one evening, as the sunset painted the sky crimson, Leah turned to her mother. "I think that's what I want to do when I grow up." Elena smiled, brushing the hair from her daughter's face. "Tell stories?" Leah nodded. "Not for people. For those who don't have a voice. I'll be the one to speak for them." Ranger stretched, his nose nudging Leah's hand, like a quiet agreement, like a passing of the torch. From that moment on, the story wasn't just theirs. It was a vow to every silent soul still waiting to be heard. Ranger had once been a warning label, a dog no one could approach, a name that made staff tense up, a body marked by fear, by wounds that spoke of battles no one saw. But now Ranger still wore the same coat, still had the same deep, soulful eyes. Only now, they no longer growled. Now those eyes could make a child feel safe in a chaotic world. Each morning, before the sunlight filtered through the apple tree out back, Leah would wake. She'd walk barefoot across the cool wooden floor, step by step toward the living room. And there, no prompting, no barking, no scratching, Ranger would already be waiting. Not in the shadows, not pressed against the wall, just sitting. Quiet, steady, as if they had an unspoken appointment. Leah would wrap her arms around his neck, gently, like hugging a living memory. Ranger would dip his head, eyes closing for a single second. One hug, simple, sacred, enough to start the day with a brand new promise, that no one would be forgotten, that no one had to growl to exist. Elena often watched from the doorway, and in that stillness, she saw something deeper than peace. She saw the resurrection. A dog once cloaked in shadows, now the morning light for a little girl growing up in a world that finally knew how to feel. And if anyone asked how Ranger was taught to be this way, Elena would only smile. "No one taught him," she'd say. "He just needed to be believed in, to be waited for, to be held." That's how a soul that once growled learned to love again. Beneath thick fur and eyes once ablaze with fear, German shepherds like Ranger aren't just creatures who need saving. They're silent healers, no language needed, no promises spoken. Just presence, gentle and steadfast. Ranger reminded us that true healing doesn't come from obedience. It comes from quiet companionship. From love, whether it's offered by a 10-year-old girl or a mother who once worked in the dark. This wasn't just a recovery story. It was proof of something simple and profound. That even those who have been hurt so deeply they no longer trust can still find their way back to the light. So love animals. Open your heart to the German shepherds of the world, because behind that guarded stare might be a heart waiting, just waiting, to be touched. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one they choose to begin again with. Winter in Wyoming didn't begin with snow, nor with wind. It began with silence. A heavy kind of silence that seeped through the pine forests and crept up the moss-covered rooftops of old cabins. To Elena Riker, that silence wasn't something to fear. On the contrary, it was the only refuge she had left after the war. Her wooden cabin sat on the outskirts of a small town, far from any main road, completely isolated. No neighbors within 5 miles, no car horns, no street lights, no strangers. Just the sounds of forest birds, the wind brushing across wooden shingles, and the soft crackle of old timber beneath her boots each morning. Elena was once a combat medic in the U.S. Army, with over 20 years of service in the brutal heat of Middle Eastern war zones. She had long lost count of how many wounds she'd stitched, how many chests she'd compressed, or how many hands she had held in their final seconds. She had known how to keep others alive, but somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. When she left the military, she brought home no medals. The only things she carried back were screams in her sleep, the choking anxiety in a crowded grocery store, and a dread for sounds others found harmless, the clang of a hammer, the beep of a garbage truck, the whistle of wind cutting through a door frame. Elena was diagnosed with severe PTSD. She had tried therapy. She had tried living in society again. But the fluorescent lights of the city made her flinch. The curiosity in a stranger's eyes made her breath hitch. And the soft question, "Are you okay?" made her want to disappear entirely. So she withdrew. Not because she was weak, but because she knew the only place she belonged was where silence lived. She made her life inside the old cabin, repairing it with her own hands. She chopped wood each day, tended a small vegetable garden. No TV, no social media. Her phone stayed on silent, no one called, and she didn't want to. Her mornings began with black coffee, a single sip for herself, and the rest poured gently onto the roots of a wild orchid by her porch. She didn't subscribe to newspapers, didn't accept mail, and never left the cabin unless absolutely necessary. To the world, it looked like isolation. To Elena, it was survival. On some nights, she sat by the fire, flickering shadows dancing along the cabin ceiling, her hands curled around an empty mug, eyes staring into the kind of void no words could name. People might think she was reflecting, but really, Elena was trying not to remember. Then, one night the sky cracked open with rain, the wind howled against the eaves, thunder tore through the forest, and amidst the storm, she heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A hoarse, broken whimper, prolonged, painful. It wasn't fear that rose in her. It was instinct, the reflex of someone who knew the sound of despair when it came from the gut. Elena grabbed a flashlight, pulled on her heavy coat, and stepped out into the downpour. She had no idea that just a few steps from her door, she would come face to face with a part of herself, in the form of a 4-legged creature, soaked to the bone, fragile and thin, staring at her with the eyes of someone who had also seen war. A German shepherd. And from that moment on, Elena's silent life began to breathe again. The rain kept falling, hard and relentless, like memories that refused to dry. Her flashlight wavered over puddles and fallen branches. Her boots sank into soft earth near the creek behind her cabin. Then she saw it. A dark shape, almost blended into the slope, unmoving by the edge of the ridge. When her light landed on it, she realized it was a dog fur matted with mud and dried blood, one leg twisted beneath its body, shallow breaths barely visible, eyes open but quiet. She didn't call it. Didn't clap her hands. No, it's okay, boy. She simply slowed her steps, lowered her light, and knelt in the rain. The dog didn't panic, didn't beg. It just knew, as if it knew she was the last thing it would see, and it no longer resisted. But Elena had seen those eyes before, in a field hospital in Helmand, in a mortar attack in Kunduz, in the bunker during a midnight siege. It was the look of someone caught between life and death, and all they needed was one person to believe they were worth saving. "You're not dying here," she whispered. No reply, but the dog stirred, faintly, as if her words had traveled through the storm, through its battered body, and into the last place where hope still lived. Elena slid her arms beneath its body, lifting gently, surprisingly light. The ribs showed through the soaked fur. The dog didn't cry out, didn't squirm, just rested its head against her chest. A trust so complete, something she thought no living being would ever give her again. She carried it inside and laid it on a blanket near the fire. She rekindled the flames. Warmth began to fill the room. Elena took a towel and slowly wiped away mud, dried blood, and pain. A deep gash along its hind leg. A burn scar at the neck. Maybe it had once been chained. Maybe trained for something cruel. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't need to know who had left it behind. All she knew was that this animal understood survival, just like she did. That night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, gently drying its fur, never once looking away. The dog breathed steadily, as if it finally believed from this moment on it would never be alone again. A name drifted softly into her thoughts, simple, quiet, but full of meaning. Aiden. It meant little fire, not a blaze, but just enough to warm a room, just enough to light the way home. She leaned in and whispered, "Sleep now, Aiden." It didn't answer, just exhaled. But at that moment, Elena knew something had begun. A quiet rebirth. For both of them. Outside, the rain continued to fall across the porch roof, the wind whispering down the mountain ridge. But inside the little wooden cabin, a strange kind of peace began to unfold. Elena remained there beside the strange creature that had wandered into her life less than an hour ago, almost afraid to move, worried that if she blinked, it would all dissolve into a rain-soaked dream. Aiden slept soundly. His body was still weak, shivering now and then from fever, but his breathing came steady like a distant lullaby only those who had known war could recognize. A steady breath, not wheezing, not ragged, was a miracle in itself. The next morning, Elena made coffee as usual, but for the first time in years, she didn't drink it alone. Aiden still lay there, head lifting slightly at the click of the gas stove, then lowering again, his eyes fluttering shut. She set the cup on the table, then gathered gauze, saline, and a clean towel. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands moved on instinct, cleansing, disinfecting, and wrapping. Every motion is slow, precise, unshaken. Those hands had once saved lives under moonless skies in the mountains of Afghanistan. But today, they did not tremble. There were no helicopters overhead, no scent of burnt gunpowder, just a dog who whimpered softly when she touched the deeper wounds. Aiden didn't growl, didn't resist. He let her tend to him as if he understood that in this cold, forgotten house, between two beings too familiar with ruin, trust wasn't something that had to be earned. It only needed to be recognized. By the third day, Aiden began to eat. Elena had cooked minced meat porridge, cooled it, and left it by the fire. The first time, he only licked at it, then turned away. By day 3, the bowl was empty. Quietly, just like everything else he did. Elena never put a collar on him, never tied a leash. The door stayed open in case he wanted to leave, but Aiden never did. By day, he lay beside the fireplace. By night, he curled near her chair, and when Elena jolted awake from a flash of nightmare, Aiden didn't bark. He simply pushed himself up, padded over, and rested his head on the edge of her mattress. That was all. And somehow, she could sleep again. One afternoon, as the last light of winter filtered sideways through the dusty window pane, Elena sat on the porch, one hand cradling an old book, the other resting limp on her knee. Aiden lay pressed against her legs, his head draped across her wool-socked feet. They stayed like that for nearly an hour with no words, no noise, but there was nothing missing in the silence. For the first time in years, she realized the house wasn't too quiet anymore. It wasn't noisy, but it wasn't empty either. There were paw steps on wooden floors. There was steady breathing by the fire. There was a gaze that followed her every move. It wasn't noise. It was life. She began calling his name in the mornings. Aiden, breakfast. Aiden, let's go. Not commands, just gentle reminders to a friend that the day had started, and they were still here. She also began writing again, in a small notebook. Not war reports, not trauma logs, but the quiet journal, where she wrote down the little things Aiden did. Today he finished his meal. Today he slept through the night. Today he wagged his tail just slightly when she returned from the gas station. What others might call ordinary, to her, was nothing short of a miracle. And so, day by day, Aiden became her silent companion, an irreplaceable part of the life Elena Riker once believed had long gone dry. She didn't call it healing. She only knew this. For the first time since the war, she didn't feel completely alone anymore. But silence doesn't always last forever. Sometimes it's only the pause before something larger is finally spoken. One morning in mid-March, with the last of the snow clinging in dull gray streaks along the roofline, a pickup truck pulled up in front of the cabin. Elena recognized the license plate instantly from Nora's, her older sister, who only called when things were truly urgent. The truck door creaked open, and from the passenger side stepped out a small girl, a backpack almost half her size clutched tight against her chest. Leah. Elena stood motionless on the porch, one hand tightening around the strap of her apron, a towel still draped over her palm. And as if by instinct, Aiden emerged from inside the house, standing beside her with no barking, no movement forward, just watching. Nora didn't waste time. "She needs a place," she said. "You're the only one left." Elena nodded. No questions, no explanations. None were needed. Leah, 10 years old, with long dark hair tied by an old rubber band, didn't look for a familiar face, didn't seek comfort. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on Aiden. 15 seconds passed. Then Aiden stepped forward. No tail wag, no growl, just stood beside her. Leah didn't smile, but she bent down, placed her small hand gently on his head. Her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Because sometimes the heaviest things, the deepest aches, don't need to be said aloud. They just need to find the right person or the right place. Elena had never been a mother, had never pictured a child inside a house meant for silence and survival. But in that moment, she understood. Her silence was no longer hers alone. In the first few days, Leah didn't ask questions, didn't complain, didn't make noise. She helped wash dishes, folded blankets, ate quietly, and when the sun was out, she read on the porch by herself. But Elena noticed one thing. Each night, no matter when Leah went to bed, Aiden would lie outside her door. He didn't rest his head on the bed, didn't ask for affection. He just lay there as a soldier on watch. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when Elena woke from one of her half-remembered nightmares, she'd hear a faint whisper from Leah's room. Not a conversation, but a soft voice reading a story. To Aiden. 1 week later, Elena found a small notebook on the kitchen table. Its pale blue cover had started to fade, one corner slightly damp. Inside were fine pencil sketches. Aiden sleeping. Aiden lifting his head. Aiden gazing out the window. No people. Until page 13. Elena paused. There, a simple sketch. The back of a woman sitting near the fireplace, a coffee mug in hand, her eyes lost in the flames. No face, just shadow. But Elena knew it was her. No one had taught Leah how to draw that. And no one had taught Aiden which door to guard each night. It wasn't training. It wasn't duty. It was instinct. The kind of recognition only shared between souls who had known hurt, who had known loss, and now recognized each other. Leah hadn't said thank you, hadn't called Elena aunt. But every morning, the girl sat by Aiden's bowl, poured water into the metal dish, tapped twice, and whispered, "Wake up, friend." And from the kitchen, Elena heard that clearer than any words she had ever received in her life. To Aiden, his bond with Leah formed like rain soaking into dry earth. No effort, no timeline. From the moment the girl crossed the threshold with that worn-out backpack and quiet eyes, Aiden had chosen to stay beside her. Not because he was a dog, but because he was a soul who understood what it meant to have nowhere left to hold on to. Leah didn't skip, didn't squeal or throw her arms around him. She didn't act like other children. She just sat nearby, looked up when Aiden shifted positions, and sometimes smiled. A small, fragile thing, as if the softest movement from Aiden could still her world, just for a moment. Each night, new pages appeared in Leah's notebook. Elena never asked, but she saw. One day, Aiden at the window, rain blurring the outside world. Another, Aiden stretching his neck at the sound of a passing truck. Another, Aiden sprawled across the porch, eyes half lost in the sky. They were just drawings. But to Elena, they were records of something more. Not noise, not routine, but life, returning one breath, one step, one sketch at a time. It was always Aiden, always the dog, and never, not once, Elena. Just silhouettes, just side angles, just quiet pencil strokes that acknowledged her presence, but never quite faced her. Elena didn't take it personally. She understood. A child who had lost her mother, sent to live with someone nearly a stranger, couldn't be expected to trust so quickly. And Elena, never one for warm words or soft gestures, had never tried to break through that ice. She let it settle, gently, carefully. One afternoon, while Elena pulled weeds in the backyard, Leah sat sketching on the porch step. Aiden lay beside her, head resting on the girl's lap. Elena could hear the faint scratching of pencil against paper, then Leah's voice, quiet as falling dust. "I saw him smile for the first time. When he was dreaming." Elena looked up. "Aiden." Leah nodded, eyes still down. "Last night I woke up. He was wagging his tail in his sleep, like he was running somewhere, his face. He looked happy. Elena didn't know how to answer. She sat down, leaning her elbows on her knees. Maybe, she said softly, he was dreaming of a place with no fear. Leah nodded again, and they both fell back into silence. That night, Elena found a folded drawing left on the dinner table. No name on it, but the lines were unmistakable. It was Aiden once again, the center of the scene. But behind him, for the first time, was a figure standing beside him. Not turned away, not a silhouette in the shadows. It was someone leaning down, placing a hand on his shoulder. There was no face. But there was something in the posture, something Elena couldn't deny. As if Leah was saying, I don't know what this is yet, but I see it, I feel it. Elena brushed her fingers lightly over the paper, carefully, as if afraid to smudge the fragile trust just beginning to take form. She didn't try to get closer to Leah, didn't force closeness, didn't perform affection. But from that night on, after cleaning up the kitchen, she began sitting on the porch a little longer, saying nothing, just being there in case Leah ever chose to sit beside her. Sometimes, the greatest gift an adult can give is space. Aiden remained the bridge between them, a dog. Yes, but carrying something only broken souls can recognize. That silence can also be a promise. That night, the mountain winds howled stronger than usual. The cold settled in fast, and Elena, as always, locked the doors, turned off the lights, and left just one lamp burning amber and small in the window. A warm glow she used in place of sleeping pills. Aiden was asleep, curled in front of Leah's bedroom door. Everything felt normal, until the nightmare returned. Elena jerked awake, her nightshirt soaked in sweat, lungs tight, breath coming in shreds, eyes wide open but seeing only what wasn't there, the battlefield, the gunfire, the screaming, the hot blood on her hands. She bolted upright, arms clutching her head, trembling. Her heart pounded so loud she feared it would burst. Her throat burned, her lips clamped shut, terrified of making a sound. Then soft footsteps. No knock, no whisper. Leah stood in the doorway, hair tousled, barefoot. In her hands, a sketchbook, draped over her shoulders, a small blanket. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort, didn't say, "Are you okay?" Because sometimes those words only make the fear worse. Leah walked over, set the notebook on the bedside table, climbed onto the sagging mattress, and tucked herself under the blanket beside Elena. No words. Just one small arm wrapping around her from behind. It was a light embrace, but steady. Enough to let someone breaking apart know there's a heartbeat next to yours. Aiden padded in moments later. No sound, just placed his head at the edge of the bed, eyes half closed, nose brushing the pillow. A quiet confirmation. Everyone's still here. At that moment, Elena wasn't a soldier, wasn't a protector, wasn't even the adult in the room. She was just a human, tired, wounded, learning how to breathe again, being held by a child who had known her own kind of tiredness. Tears fell into the pillow, but not from pain, from the overwhelming relief of being touched, without fear. By morning, Leah had returned to her room. Neither of them spoke about the night. But when Elena went to make breakfast, she found a loose page fallen from Leah's sketchbook. There were 3 figures: a woman curled on the floor, a child holding her from behind, and a dog, head resting on the bed frame. No colors, just pencil lines, deep, steady, full of breath. In the corner, written in tiny handwriting, "Last night, 3 people breathed, and no one was afraid anymore." Elena folded the page. not to hide it, but to keep it safe. From that day forward, the night was never mentioned again. But something had shifted. Something unspoken had been named not with words, but with footsteps. Aiden no longer slept outside Leah's door. He now lay between the two rooms. Leah, on occasion, would bring a cup of tea upstairs when she noticed Elena sitting too long in silence. And Elena, when startled by a dropped pan or paralyzed by a flash of light, would feel a small hand gently grip hers, just tight enough to remind her she didn't have to be strong alone anymore. 3 souls, 3 wounds, now breathing in the same rhythm. One afternoon, while Elena was reorganizing an old wooden cabinet in the storage room, the place where she kept things long unused, she came across a small rusted tin box. Inside were a few slim books, some yellowed notebooks, and at the very bottom, a dog training manual. She nearly passed it by. But Leah, who had somehow been standing behind her the whole time, bent down quietly, picked it up, and blew away the dust. "What's this?" she asked. Elena glanced over. "Just something your mom once brought here," she said. "There was a time she wanted to train dogs for therapy, but she never got the chance." Leah said nothing. She began flipping through the pages slowly. No glossy pictures, just notes, diagrams, instructions on how to use hand signals, eye contact, and how to build trust through consistency. Something about it felt inspiring. Elena went back to sorting things, but a few minutes later, Leah spoke again, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. "I think Aiden would like to learn these." Elena turned. "Learn for what?" she asked gently. Leah pressed her lips together for a moment, then answered. "Not to perform, just I like playing, so he's happy, and so we can do something together." She didn't say it loudly, didn't try to persuade, but in her eyes was something rare, not a child's plea for attention, but a quiet longing to connect. Elena took the manual and flipped through a few pages. Simple exercises. Sit, down, walk beside, stop on cue. She gave a small smile, not wide, just a curve at the corner of her mouth. But Leah saw it, and she knew what it meant. "All right then, let's give it a try." Their first session was held in the backyard, where the wild grass had begun to push through after the long winter. Leah held the training book, proudly playing the role of assistant director. Elena would give the commands. At first, Aiden seemed completely unconvinced. He glanced between the two of them, then sighed and lay down, his gaze drifting as if waiting for the real game to start. But then Elena clapped once, gently, and called, "Aiden, come here!" He stood. Not fast, not eager, but he walked straight to her, stopping half a meter away. "Good boy," Elena murmured, then turned to Leah. "What's next?" Leah flipped through the book. "Teach him to sit. Hand down like this, then say, 'Sit.'" Elena mimicked the gesture. "Sit." Aiden didn't sit. He just stared into her eyes, alert, steady, like he was waiting for something real, not just a cue. Elena understood. She knelt, touched his head gently, no command, no insistence, just a whisper. "If you're willing to try, then so am I." And Aiden sat. Not because he was trained, but because they had agreed. Leah clapped softly, without fanfare, but her face lit up. For the first time since she arrived, she smiled with her whole face. Elena looked at her, then at Aiden, and in that brief moment, she no longer felt like a battle-worn soldier or a woman bound to the shadows of the past. She felt like she belonged to something just beginning to grow. From that day on, each morning after cleaning the kitchen and checking Aiden's old wounds, Elena and Leah stepped into the yard together. No stopwatches, no trainers, just one notebook, a few pencils, and 3 beings learning slowly, patiently, how to trust one another again. Elena never called it training. Leah never called it practice. They were just doing something together, routinely, gently, without needing perfection. Aiden quickly learned the rhythm. No treats, no firm commands, just a signal from Elena, a glance, a gesture, and Aiden knew. And every time he got it right, Leah's soft clap followed as if, with each small step, the world was quietly falling into place. Elena began to realize the most valuable part of their training sessions wasn't the result. It was the rhythm of breathing. Each morning began not with commands, but with breath. Before giving a signal, Elena would draw in a deep inhale, not to assert control, but to remind herself she was still here, still anchored to some part of the world she hadn't let slip away. Aiden didn't respond because he was trained. He responded because he could feel the steadiness in her breath. And Leah, always seated by the fence, quietly sketching the scene in pencil and hush, would sometimes say, "Today, you breathed slower than yesterday. Aiden walked softer, too." No one had taught her to say that. But Elena understood. She understood that each exercise wasn't just for Aiden's reflexes. It was how the 3 of them, each carrying their own fracture, were learning how to feel in control again. One day, a truck engine roared too close to the cabin, and Elena's body spiraled. She dropped to the grass, breath clipped and erratic, the world spinning. Leah rushed to her. No questions, no panic, just placed a small hand gently on Elena's back. Aiden stepped in front of her, calm and focused. He didn't bark, didn't panic. He simply placed a paw on her knee, tilted his head, and locked eyes with her as if to say, "Inhale. Slowly. You're still here." And Elena did. Inhale. Exhale. Again. The session was canceled that day, but something had quietly shifted. It wasn't a lesson for Aiden. It was a lesson for Elena. That when she couldn't control the world outside, she could still choose how she responded to it inside. That afternoon, as sunlight softened across the worn fence posts, Leah came forward with a new drawing. This one was different. Aiden was no longer alone on the page. He was walking behind Elena, tail raised in a light wag, head tilted gently. And for the first time, Elena's face was drawn not in detail, but clear, facing forward, no longer staring into void. "What did you see when you drew this?" Elena asked softly. Leah smiled. "I saw Aiden walking behind you," she said. "But you were leading." Elena froze. She hadn't thought of herself as someone who led anything since the day she left the military. In her own mind, she was just a survivor. Someone who had been dragged from a battlefield carrying wounds no one could stitch shut. But now, every cue she gave Aiden, every lifted chin, every deliberate step, it was all saying, "I'm moving forward." And someone was choosing to follow. Leah. Aiden. And maybe a version of herself she had never known. From that day forward, things felt different, not drastically, but just enough for her to notice. Mornings were no longer a cycle of repeated tasks. Clean the kitchen, split wood, boil porridge for the dog. Every act now held meaning. Not just maintenance, but connection. When Aiden successfully completed the sit, lie down, stay sequence, Elena no longer smiled out of politeness. She felt proud, not because she'd trained a dog, but because she had steadied her breath, focused her eyes, and kept her voice calm enough for Aiden to respond. It was something she thought she had lost, the ability to be present. There was a time she sat in crowded rooms, and felt like she was underwater. A time she spoke to people but couldn't recall a single word they'd said. One time she stared at her own face in the mirror and didn't know who she was looking at. But now, in each moment, Elena was there. Not a ghost, not a shell, but herself. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, Leah hugging a pillow, Aiden stretched across the steps, and Elena slicing dried apples for a pie, Leah suddenly asked, "Have you ever been afraid of being seen?" Elena paused mid-slice. She placed the knife down and looked out over the trees. The last glow of sunset had pulled away from the treetops. "Yes," she said slowly. "I've been afraid of being seen, but I was even more afraid of not being seen at all." "Not being seen?" Leah echoed. "Not seeing myself," Elena clarified. "Not knowing if I was still alive, only surviving out of habit, not out of purpose." Leah was quiet, but her gaze stayed on Elena. And it wasn't a pity, it was recognition, like someone who had been lost in that same limbo. "And now?" Leah asked softly. Elena turned. "Now," she said, "now I feel alive. When Aiden understands me, when you smile, when the air turns cold and I know it's almost pumpkin pie season." She swallowed a lump in her throat. "And when I can answer your question without being afraid, it'll break me." Leah didn't say anything more. But she pulled a small paper from her pocket, not a drawing this time, but a short poem. Childlike, scribbled, uneven, but full of truth. Someone once lost themselves, then found the way back in a dog's footsteps and the eyes of someone who never asked, "Are you okay?" I just stayed, quiet, and waited. Elena held the paper. She didn't know what to say. But she knew this wasn't an assignment. It wasn't a game. It was proof of trust. Later, during a trip to the town supply store, her first in months, Elena stood at the checkout line. Aiden sat calmly at her heel. No leash, no commands, just presence. An elderly woman behind her said softly, "My, you've trained that dog well. I'm impressed." Elena turned, and for the first time in years, she smiled, not politely, but honestly. "Oh, I didn't train him," she replied. "Oh? So he's just naturally well-behaved?" Elena paused, then said, "Not exactly. We learned together." And as she paid for her things, Elena felt something unexpected. She was being seen. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid of it. That afternoon, when they returned home, Leah sat on the porch steps, her hand resting on Aiden's head as he dozed beside her after the long ride. On her lap was a thin packet from the veterinary clinic, a slightly smudged full-color flyer that read, "Countywide Dog Obedience Competition next month at the Town Civic Center." Leah didn't speak right away, but her gaze kept drifting from the flyer, to Aiden, to Elena, as if weighing whether it was okay to say what was quietly blooming inside her. Elena was out by the fence, watering the vegetable beds. The breeze stirred the leaves gently, rustling like whispers across the yard. And then Leah spoke. Not suddenly, but without hesitation. "Auntie, do you want to try the contest?" Elena froze. The hose water continued its path, a thin stream hitting the dirt, soaking into the dry earth until it overflowed. She turned, eyes moving from Leah to Aiden, who had lifted his head, as if he'd heard too. No bark, no reaction, just his eyes on Elena. Waiting. "Try what?" Elena asked. Her voice had lost the usual firmness. "The competition," Leah said, lifting the flyer. Her hand trembled slightly. "In town. I think Aiden could do it. And you, too." Elena walked slowly over and sat beside her. She took the flyer and scanned it line by faded line. basic command sequences, response to audio cues, walking off-leash beside the handler. She felt her throat tighten. Sweat pooled in her palms, despite the gentle weather. The town, crowds, loudspeakers, strangers, all those eyes, and worse memories that never warned before striking, the scream of ambulance sirens, the flashing red lights, the terrified faces of fellow soldiers beneath artillery fire. It all rushed in not with noise, but with weight, like a gray wave cresting high and cold, returning her to the canvas walls of the field hospital, blood at her boots, voices crackling on the radio, the smell of smoke. Leah was quiet for a while, then said gently, never pushing, "It's okay. I just thought, if Aiden was on that stage, people could see how amazing he is. The way I do." Elena looked at her. There was something in Leah's eyes, not expectation, but hope. The kind of hope only children who've lost something understand. The kind they don't place in outcomes, but in trying. Elena took a long breath. "I don't know, Leah." Leah smiled soft and real, her fingers trailing down Aiden's back. "Me neither," she whispered. "But I don't think we have to know. We just... go. Try." Elena let out a small laugh. This time the smile tilted unevenly, but unforced. "Then I guess we'll try." Aiden wagged his tail, the kind of answer that didn't need translation. That night, Elena sat alone in the kitchen. Her tea had gone cold in her hands. Outside the window, the trees rocked gently in the wind, like memories passing through, no longer clawing, just gliding by. She closed her eyes. The battlefield returned. But this time, the images didn't splinter her. They passed, like familiar ghosts nodding at someone who was learning to live again. She opened her eyes and looked toward Leah's room, where the little girl now slept beneath a poster for the competition, taped above her bed. Then her eyes drifted to Aiden, curled beneath the kitchen table, chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm. She knew now. This time she wasn't going in alone. That morning, the city sky hung gray, but it wasn't cold. Thin clouds drifted slowly, casting soft light over a town buzzing with weekend energy. Inside the Civic Center, an old gymnasium, now repurposed for local events, the loudspeaker echoed at steady intervals. Team announcements, heat schedules, cheering voices. Elena stepped out of the car, her hand rested lightly on Aiden's back. Not to control him, but to steady herself. She felt the trembling begin at her fingertips. Her heartbeat thundered not from any real danger, but from a place deeper than reason. This wasn't rational fear. This was the reflex of memory, the neon glare of the signage, the echo of the loudspeakers, the blur of passing faces smiling, observing, unaware. All of it pulled her back to her time on duty, when every sound might mean danger. A light wave of dizziness swept over her as they entered the lobby. And then she felt a gentle tug on the leash. Aiden wasn't pulling, wasn't anxious. He simply turned his head, met her eyes, and waited. Aiden. He didn't speak, but his gaze said everything. "We've come this far, and you are not alone." Leah reached for her hand, not tightly, but firmly enough. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" because she knew. Grown-ups can nod yes 100 times and still not be fine. Instead, Leah said simply, "Just look at Aiden, not the people." Their number was called. Elena and Aiden stepped onto the floor, moving between 2 rows of folding chairs packed with spectators. Her eyes, despite herself, began to scan. The crowd, the cameras, the judges, poised with scorecards in hand. A voice crackled over the intercom. their entry number. Not loud. But the mechanical ring carried an edge, and to Elena, it sounded just like the sirens from deployment. Those pre-dawn mobilizations. The emergencies with no warning. Her chest tightened. Her breath fragmented. Aiden turned, looked up at her steady, calm, then stepped close and pressed his head against her shin. A simple gesture. But it anchored her, pulled her out of memory and into now. Elena inhaled, then again, and nodded to the judges, her hand still resting on Aiden's head. The test begin. First challenge, off-leash walking. Aiden moved in sync at her left side exactly the right distance. Not once did he drift. A murmur spread through the audience, surprised by the precision and the absence of verbal commands. Second challenge, sit down and stand with hand signals. Aiden executed each move flawlessly, eyes locked on Elena. She never raised her voice, never barked orders like some of the other competitors, only used her hands, her eyes, and something deeper. Trust. They weren't performing. They were practicing something they'd both had to learn to survive, reading each other's breath. When the trial ended, the room held its breath. Then, applause rising like a wave. Elena didn't register the voices. She only felt Leah's small hand wrap around hers as they returned to their seats. Aiden still walked at her side, tail swaying gently as if nothing had changed. But Elena knew he'd just walked her through a different kind of battlefield. Not one of war, but of fear, and the quiet triumph over it. She sat. Aiden curled beneath her legs. Leah leaned her head on her shoulder. "You did it," the girl whispered. Elena didn't reply right away. She looked at her hands no longer trembling. Then she said softly, "We did it." The waiting time before the final results felt like the longest part of the day, not because it dragged on, but because inside Elena, something unfamiliar was settling. Peace. She didn't care about scores. Honestly, the moment she stepped off the arena floor, she already knew she had done the only thing that mattered. She didn't run. Aiden looked up at her a few times, then placed his head on Leah's lap. The girl stroked his ears gently, asking nothing more. Their silence wasn't a gap anymore. It was harmony. Then the loudspeaker called their names. Champion of the division. At first, Elena didn't register it. Only when she saw every face turn toward her and heard the applause swell again did it click. Leah looked up, eyes shining. "They called you," she smiled. Elena didn't stand right away, but Aiden rose unprompted, walked to her feet, and tilted his head, as if saying, "This one's for you. You can accept it now." Elena stood. I walked toward the stage. Her heart wasn't racing, not because she wasn't nervous, but because, for the first time, she could breathe through it. The award was small, a modest trophy, made of brushed alloy with no grandeur, but in her hands, it weighed more than any military medal she'd ever carried. The announcer offered her the microphone. Elena looked down, at Leah, grinning from the front row, at Aiden, sitting at attention by the steps. She took a breath, then said, "I used to think my life ended the day I took off the uniform. I used to think I'd never stand in front of a crowd again. But thanks to a dog and a 10-year-old girl, I found my way back from the things that once held me captive." Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Today, I'm not standing here because I won. I'm standing here because I can stand." Applause erupted again, not for obedience routines or trophies, but for the journey behind every step she'd taken. After the ceremony, a man in a leather jacket approached Elena. He looked like someone who belonged at these competitions. Sharp eyes, a rigid posture, a gaze that lingered a little too long. "You're Ms. Riker?" he said, extending a hand. "I'm Grant Killian. I sponsor several competitions out west." Elena shook his hand. It was cold, and his eyes scanned Aiden not with affection, but with assessment, like he was weighing value. "That's quite the dog you've got," he said. Elena nodded. "He is, not because he's perfect, but because he's never left my side." Grant gave a thin smile. "I run a few advanced training camps. If you ever want to take Aiden to a professional level, give me a call." He handed her a business card. Thick stock, embossed ink, formal lettering. Elena accepted it, said nothing. She made no promises, but something in his eyes as he turned away left her with a chill, a sense that something wasn't quite right. That night when they returned home, Leah climbed onto a stool and placed the small trophy on the highest corner of the bookshelf. No music, no celebration, no balloons. Just Aiden stretched across the living room floor, his head resting quietly on Elena's leg. Leah nestled beside them. The three of them sat watching the flicker of the fire, crackling gently inside the stove. Elena placed her hand on Aiden's head, leaned in, and whispered, "No rank, no medals. But today was a victory." And Aiden, in his own silent way, replied, with his steady breath, with the warmth of his body, with the kind of presence that doesn't make noise, but holds everything in place, like a pillar, anchoring a soul that has finally found solid ground. As the applause still echoed faintly, and Leah was carefully adjusting the angle on her little camera to take a keepsake photo of the three of them in front of the event backdrop, Elena felt a chill crawl down her spine, even though the temperature in the arena hadn't changed. She turned her head, not knowing if it was instinct or reflex, and caught a gaze fixed directly on them. A man stood just beyond the judging area, blended into the crowd. A polished brown leather coat, hair slicked back. Nothing about him screamed for attention. And yet, he stood out in a sea of cheering spectators precisely because he didn't move. He didn't clap, didn't smile, didn't nod in rhythm with the crowd. He simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, chin slightly lifted, eyes locked on Aiden with a look that weighed, not witnessed. Elena knew that look. She'd seen it before on the battlefield, in the eyes of commanding officers evaluating soldiers like gear, in private contractors watching drones as if they were tech prototypes. No feeling, only calculation. Leah tugged gently on Elena's hand. "Auntie, let's go celebrate?" Elena smiled and nodded. But that stare, it didn't leave her mind. On the drive home, Aiden lay curled in the back seat, his head resting on Leah's lap. She had fallen asleep, still hugging the little trophy as if it were treasure. Elena drove slowly, not because of the roads, but because she needed the time to think. What was that man's name? The thought came unbidden, but part of her already had known from the moment he handed her that glossy card the day before. Grant Killian, a well-known sponsor in the competitive dog circuit, but also the owner of a controversial chain of advanced training camps. There had been whispers, allegations, even a regional expose published by a small out-of-state newspaper detailing claims of abusive practices and inhumane conditions. But the story vanished. Witnesses recanted. Surprise inspections found pristine facilities. Too pristine. Elena hadn't wanted to assume the worst. But Killian's eyes weren't the eyes of a man who loved animals. They were the eyes of someone who saw value. And Aiden, with his steady posture, sharp gaze, and effortless obedience, was exactly the kind of asset someone like Killian would want. Elena gripped the wheel tighter. Number. She whispered it inwardly, not as a thought, but a decision. Aiden is not for sale, not for show, not for control. Aiden is family. He's a friend. He is the part of my soul I thought I had lost. That night, back at the cabin, Elena didn't sleep right away. She made tea and stood by the window, staring out at the backyard where Aiden usually stretched in the sun. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. And that made her uneasy. Aiden lay asleep beneath Leah's bed. The girl still hugged the trophy in sleep, like a child cradling what she believed was the most beautiful thing in her world. Elena entered her room and locked the door. But for the first time in months, she placed a chair under the doorknob. A habit from border deployments, something old and deeply buried. She couldn't say why, just a feeling that something was about to happen. Morning came. Nothing was different. Leah woke earlier than usual and helped make breakfast. Aiden lay in his usual spot by the living room rug, head resting lightly on the edge, his eyes half closed, watching the door. That afternoon, they trained a little in the yard. Aiden seemed a bit sluggish but cooperative. Elena chalked it up to post-event fatigue and let him finish early. The evening passed quietly. Leah sketches. Elena reread old notes in her training journal, marking some changes in Aiden's timing. When it came time for bed, Aiden resumed his place, lying across the doorway to Leah's room. Elena kissed the girl on the forehead before retreating to her own room, a habit she'd picked up from Leah's gentle presence. There were no sounds that night. No barking, no footsteps, just silence. So deep it hummed. Monday morning. Elena woke later than usual. Sunlight had already stretched across the bed, warming the sheets. She slipped on her sweater, intending to make tea. But when she opened her door, she paused. The chair from the night before, the one braced under the doorknob, was pushed askew. She frowned. Maybe I misaligned it, she reasoned. Maybe I didn't wedge it properly. She stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No nails clicking across the wood floors. No tail thumping. No Aiden. She crossed the hall and opened Leah's door. The girl was still fast asleep, but Aiden wasn't there. The space by the door where he always curled up was empty. A weight rose in Elena's chest, a sharp, nameless panic. She called out, "Aiden?" No response. She called again. Still no pause. No rustling. Only emptiness. Elena ran down the hallway, checking every room. Nothing. She burst out into the backyard. No paw prints. The gate was still locked. She rushed around to the back kitchen door, and her heart clenched. The door was ajar. The heavy wooden door, usually stiff, needing force to open, was now swinging slightly in the morning wind, creaking gently. The lock hadn't been broken. No signs of forced entry. But Elena stormed into the backyard, her eyes scanning every square foot of grass, every fence corner. Nothing. No barking. No sign of Aiden. She ran back into the house. "Leah, down here!" The girl came stumbling down the stairs, still groggy from sleep. But when she saw the look in Elena's eyes, she woke fully. "What's wrong?" Elena didn't answer right away. She opened the cabinet near the door. The leash was still there, untouched, hanging neatly on its hook. "Where's Aiden?" Leah's voice began to tremble. Elena shook her head. She tried to keep her tone calm. "He's not here, and the back door, it was open." Leah raised her hand to her mouth. "No, he would never leave. He never leaves." Elena felt her body begin to react. Cold sweat, heart hammering, breath stuttering. Every sound became too loud, the hum of the fridge, the rustle of the trees outside, the ticking clock. PTSD. It didn't knock. It entered like it always had, uninvited, total, and merciless. Elena gripped the edge of a chair, trying to breathe. But everything she'd learned, everything she'd fought to overcome, was unraveling. Aiden was gone. No trace, no struggle, no warning bark. It was as if someone had simply opened the door and Aiden had been taken. Leah stood frozen, clutching the hem of her shirt. "Auntie, he's coming back, right?" Elena couldn't answer. For the first time in months, she felt the full weight of helplessness. She sank to the floor, knees hitting the wooden boards by the back door, her eyes wide but unfocused. Every sound turned into a dull, suffocating hum. Her hand moved to her chest, to the place where a formless pain began to spread like frost. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't control her limbs. Her body folded inward. Her jaw trembled. And inside her mind, memories exploded without mercy. The first time she lost a fellow soldier. The ambush when she had to leave behind a young medic in the dust. The night she woke up deafened by her own screams, ones she had never released. And now, this, losing Aiden, not to war, but because she let her guard down just once, one mistake, and it had cost her everything. Elena curled in on herself, arms around her shoulders, her face blank. She didn't cry, she couldn't. Like a well-run dry, no matter how hard you shake it, not a single drop will fall. Leah stepped forward. Slowly, without speaking. She didn't understand the depths of what was unraveling inside this adult, but she could feel one thing clearly. Elena, the steady one, the one who always said, "It's going to be okay," was breaking. Leah knelt in front of her. Her small hand reached out, rested on the back of Elena's trembling hand. No reaction. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but please, don't disappear again, okay?" Her voice cracked. "I only have you now." 5 words. No decoration, no lesson learned from any book. But they sliced through Elena like an arrow, straight into the softest, most hidden place in her chest. Elena blinked. She turned her head, and for the first time, she didn't see a child who needed protecting. She saw a pair of eyes, holding her back from drowning. Her breath hitched. A soft sob escaped her lips, small, like the first crack in a dam. But Leah didn't let go. The little girl wrapped her arms tightly around Elena, even though her small frame could barely wrap around anything at all. And in that moment, Elena began to cry. Not loudly, not violently. Just tears falling onto Leah's shoulder, drop by drop, as if washing away fragments of memory too long held in silence. She couldn't keep the armor on anymore. She was no longer a soldier. No longer the strong aunt. She was just a woman who had just lost the one thing she didn't know was holding her together, and who was now being held by the one thing she couldn't bear to lose. A child who still believed in her. Minutes passed. Her breathing began to slow. She rested her forehead against Leah's shoulder and whispered, voice raw, "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Leah replied. "But now we have to find Aiden. Remember? We don't let each other disappear." Elena nodded. And in that quiet nod, a spark lit somewhere in the back of her mind, faint but steady. If someone had taken Aiden, then there had to be a way to bring him home. She couldn't let fear win this time, not after all she had survived, not now when she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, they began. Elena printed the first batch of flyers using the old, clunky printer in her home office, the clearest photo of Aiden front and center, beneath bold, desperate words. "Missing therapy dog, we can't live without him." Below that was her phone number, a promised reward, and a quiet plea. "If you see Aiden, you're looking at the heart of a family." Leah sat nearby, trimming the flyer edges, stacking each set neatly, securing tape to the corners. She didn't say much, but her eyes held a focus more resolute than any soldier Elena had served with. Elena began calling nearby vet clinics, animal shelters, and homes across the region. She drove from neighborhood to neighborhood, posting flyers along fences, pinning them to bulletin boards, power poles, roadside signs anywhere someone might look twice. Some people said they saw a dog like Aiden on a road up north. Some asked, "Are you sure he's missing? Maybe he just wandered off." Elena shook her head. "Aiden doesn't wander. He always comes back. Unless someone stopped him." She visited the town police station, a place tied to a name she'd hoped to never revisit. Carson Blake, the sheriff, and the man who'd once shared a battlefield with her 10 years ago. Carson stepped out from behind the duty desk the moment he heard her name. Still tall, his beard now streaked with gray, his eyes quieter than she remembered. "Riker, what happened?" Elena handed him a flyer. No speech, just silence and paper. Carson skimmed it, then looked up. "He's a therapy dog?" "He's family," she answered. Her voice was worn thin from 3 sleepless nights. Carson nodded once, then motioned her into the back. The briefing room still smelled of wood and burnt coffee. Elena told him everything the day of the competition. Grant Killian's stare, the eerie silence that followed, the door left ajar. She didn't accuse him outright, but the suspicion in her tone left no doubt. "I don't have proof," Elena admitted, "but my gut, it's never been wrong when someone's life was in danger." Carson leaned back slowly. "I trusted your gut on the field. I'll trust it now." He took notes, recorded Aiden's details, then sighed. "I've heard of Killian. There've been reports, but he's slick. Big money, sharp lawyers, wide network. But if there's a crack, we'll find it." Elena left the station with something she hadn't felt in 2 days, the sense that she wasn't alone in the dark anymore. That night, back at home, Leah sat quietly, coloring in her sketch of Aiden, this time showing him standing by a fence, eyes fixed on a distant line of trees. "I think he's waiting for us," she said, her voice like a quiet promise. Elena brushed a hand over the girl's hair and replied, "Then we'll find him. Step by step, even if we have to search every inch of this town." The next morning, Elena returned to the sheriff's station, not to hope, but to act. She didn't wear her usual long coat, but a faded army shirt, a quiet reminder to herself, "You've walked into battles before. You didn't run then. You won't run now." Carson met her in the hallway. He handed her a coffee, then pointed toward the information board in the briefing room. "There's something you need to see." Pinned to the board was a satellite map of the western outskirts scattered with private properties, warehouses, abandoned barns, and one red-marked point circled in permanent marker. Grant Killian, Training Compound X-12, renamed 3 times in 5 years. "I'd heard that name during an anonymous complaint years back," Carson said, "but we never had a search warrant, and Killian's paperwork is always spotless, almost too spotless." Elena studied the map. Remote. 4 miles from the nearest vet station, the neighborhood's CCTV coverage just happened to skip that area. "Exactly," Carson nodded. "I've suspected an underground dog trafficking ring trained dogs stolen and sold into gambling circuits out of state, but never found proof." Elena frowned. "Aiden's not the kind of dog they'd sell publicly. He's already been seen, photographed, documented. If they took him, they had something else in mind." Carson's eyes darkened. "Could be for advanced training trials, or forced performance, sold to overseas buyers." "So a slave, Just wearing fur, Elena said, voice cold. And if he doesn't comply... Carson didn't finish. He didn't need to. A slow, molten anger began rising in her, not explosive, but like magma under tectonic pressure. I need to go there, Elena said. Carson shook his head. You can't. We're working to get a search warrant. If you move now, you'll blow it. I'm not trying to crack a case, she said quietly. I'm trying to get my family back. Carson looked at her for a long time, then sighed. I know you're still the one who acts, but this time, let me act for you, okay? That evening, back home, Elena told Leah what they'd learned. The girl didn't ask when Aiden would come back. She only asked, if they took him, do you think Aiden's scared? Elena looked into those eyes that waited for a truth too raw to be sugar-coated. Maybe, she said softly. But Aiden, he's the bravest boy I know. Fear won't win, and he knows. We're looking. Leah nodded. Then we don't stop looking. Elena glanced at the sketchbook Leah had left open, this time a scene drawn at night. Aiden sitting in darkness, but his eyes glowing. Above him, a single star. What's that? Elena asked. Leah smiled. It's the light he's waiting for. It's us. But not everyone believed in that light. 2 days later, while Elena was hanging another flyer for Aiden in the corner grocery store, she noticed something shift. The looks, not pity anymore. But something else, unfamiliar glances, threads of doubt woven into silence, whispers that trailed behind her like a shadow she couldn't shake. At checkout, the cashier, an older woman who once knew Leah's mother, leaned forward and whispered, I don't mean offense, Elena, but people are talking. Some say you made all this up for attention. Maybe hoping for money? From the media or some rescue foundation? Elena froze. Made it up? I'm not saying I believe it, the woman said quickly. But you know how small towns are. A lost dog making it all the way to the city bulletin. Some folks think it's a bit much. Elena said nothing. She simply nodded, paid, and walked out. But inside, something snapped. Elena once thought the fight would only be against fear, against Grant Killian, against time. But now she realized sometimes what wounds deepest isn't a broken door or a missing clue. It's indifference. It's doubt. That night she told Leah everything. Not to complain, but because the child needed to know. Not everyone will recognize what's right from the start. Leah sat quietly for a long time, then slowly opened her old laptop, clicking into a folder marked Aiden. Inside were clips, moments, memories all saved from a phone that barely worked, but always pointed toward the dog that mattered most. She found a video, just over a minute long. Aiden was walking near the park during a light drizzle. In the video, an elderly man slipped at the curb. Without hesitation, Aiden darted forward, placing his body between the man and an oncoming vehicle. Elena could be heard calling out, running to catch up, but it was Aiden who reached him first. Aiden who stood guard. Aiden who held still until help arrived. No one was hurt, but something was protected that day, and it wasn't just a body. It was something far more fragile. Leah turned to Elena. Can I post it? Elena hesitated. She never liked being public, but this time, silence had become its own kind of harm. Post it, she said, but not for pity. Post it to remind people Aiden is not a dog you forget. The video went live that night with a quiet caption. The dog in this video is Aiden. Now he's missing, and one grown woman and one little girl are looking for him. Every day. Within 24 hours, the clip spread across local community pages. Comments poured in. What happened to this dog? Why isn't anyone talking about it? Loyalty like this shouldn't go unanswered. A call came from a local news outlet. The reporter, a former student of Elena's, asked if they could cover the story. Elena agreed, not for attention, but because now, silence was no longer an option. That evening, as the wind whispered against the tin roof, Leah rested her head on Elena's shoulder. She murmured, "I'm not afraid of what people say anymore." "Why?" "Because if we stay quiet, then maybe they do get to believe the wrong thing. But if we stand up, then at least they'll have to look again." Elena didn't answer. But inside, for the first time in days, she felt it. Aiden was being seen, even if he wasn't home yet. The next morning, Elena's phone rang. It was Carson. "There's a video," he said. "Gas station on the northern outskirts. A gray pickup stopped there at 2:47 a.m., the same night Aiden went missing." Elena tightened her grip on the phone. "Did you get the license plate?" "Part of it. It's blurry, but the make and model match a truck once owned by one of Killian's former employees." Elena paused. "What were they carrying?" "Can't say. The bed of the truck was covered. But here's the strange part. 2 hours later, that same truck shows up again on the highway, right near a private vet clinic that was supposedly shut down 3 years ago." "A vet clinic?" "On paper, it's closed, but neighbors say they've seen people coming and going, only at night. No signs, no lights. The door only opens wide enough to let an animal through." Elena stood up. Her palms were soaked with sweat. "We need to go there." "I already filed for a civil inspection order," Carson replied. "But we need a court mandate. If you go now without legal grounds—" "Carson," Elena interrupted, her voice low and firm. "You know me better than anyone. I don't take reckless chances. But I'm not about to sit around and wait on paperwork while a part of my family might be trapped in there, hurt, caged, or worse." Carson went quiet. Then, slowly, "Give me 2 hours. I'll go first. If there's anything at all, I'll call. But Elena, if I don't call, you have to promise me you won't go in alone." Elena nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I promise." 2 hours later, her phone buzzed. Carson's voice was strained. "There's dried blood at the door, a broken chain across the threshold, dog prints, but no dog." "Aiden?" "I'm not sure, but I know blood. This is fresh, no more than 3 days old. Someone was here, and someone fought back." Elena drove straight to the station. She found Carson waiting in the investigation room. He handed her a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a worn leather strap, marked with a hand-carved letter L. Elena's heart clenched. It was the charm Leah had made by hand, the one she'd tied to Aiden's collar. "His lucky tag," she'd called it. Aiden never took it off. Carson looked at her. Then he was there, and maybe he still is. Elena stood taller, her eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Then we're done waiting. We're going to find him. Now." Carson's truck turned onto a dirt path leading to a small house buried behind eucalyptus trees. The old wooden sign out front read, "Owen's Veterinary Clinic." The letters nearly faded to nothing. The front door was ajar. No one answered when Carson knocked. "We go in," he said. "Technically, this place is no longer a licensed facility. If an animal's being kept illegally, we have the right to intervene." Elena didn't wait. She stepped across the threshold like a soldier entering enemy ground. No more fear, just her heartbeat steady. Sharp. Inside, it was dim. The air is thick with antiseptic and the metallic tang of dried blood. Steel cages lined both walls. Most were empty. A few had old water bowls, some with moldy biscuit crumbs. Then soft, faint, almost mist. A scratching sound from the far corner behind a torn curtain. Elena moved toward it. "Aiden!" A whimper, hoarse but alive. Carson pulled the curtain aside. Elena froze. Aiden was curled tight in a cage too small for his body. His fur matted, neck caked with blood. One leg was raw and swollen, scratched down to exposed pink skin. Chain marks cut deep around his shoulders and throat, but his eyes were open, still watching, still waiting. And when those eyes met Elena's, the whole world stopped. Elena knelt down, her fingers brushing gently against the cage bars. "It's me. I'm here, Aiden." No bark, no howl. Aiden simply tried to lift his head, then let it fall again. His tail gave a soft thump, weak but intentional. Carson used bolt cutters to break the lock. The door swung open. Elena reached in, slowly, carefully. She wrapped her arms around Aiden. His body was limp, but not lifeless. He pushed his head up, just enough to nuzzle her shoulder, then tucked it in deeper like he needed to make sure this wasn't just a dream. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks, soaking into the grime on his fur. But she didn't cry out, didn't fall apart. She just held Aiden, like she was holding a piece of herself she thought she'd lost forever. "I've got you now, Aiden. No one's taking you again. Not ever." Carson did a quick check. No broken bones, no major bleeding, but he's severely dehydrated. Might be hypoglycemic. We need to get him to the clinic, fast. Elena nodded. "I'll follow close behind." By the time they pulled into town, night had fallen. On the porch stood Leah, clutching Aiden's old fur-lined jacket like a lifeline. When the car stopped, she ran forward. And when she saw Carson lift Aiden carefully into his arms, still breathing, eyes open, Leah burst into sobs. "He's alive! He waited for me! I told you! I told you!" Elena placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You kept your promise, and Aiden, he's never walked away from anyone." Aiden was rushed to the clinic. The vets confirmed his condition. Weakened, malnourished, with surface injuries, but miraculously his spirit remained untouched. "We've seen dogs break after just 3 days on a chain," one doctor said. "This boy lasted almost 8. Still responsive, still trying to stand, still watching the room. His will is like steel." Elena gave a tired smile. "Not steel, it's an unbreakable heart." That night, back home, Elena laid out the old rug beneath her bed, the one Aiden used to curl up on. He was wrapped in a warm blanket, his head resting on Leah's lap, as the three of them sat quietly together. No words, no explanations, just the sound of breathing, and the quiet knowing. They had come home. The next morning, Carson arrived. No casual knock, no smile, just the weight of something heavy. "Good news first," he said. "Killian's under surveillance. We got more data from a former transport driver who worked for him." "And the bad news?" Elena asked, already bracing. Carson met her gaze. "Killian isn't acting alone. There's a parent company behind him, registered out of state. Enough legal shielding to make direct criminal charges nearly impossible." Elena clenched her fists. "He took Aiden. He runs the cages, the torture training. He's the core of it." "I know," Carson said, "but if we move without federal warrants, the whole case could collapse in court." "And if I move?" Elena asked quietly. Carson hesitated. "I can't advise that. But if you choose that road, don't let me know beforehand." Elena nodded once. "I don't need a permit to tell the truth." That afternoon, she drove into the heart of town, stopped outside a modest office building, the front for Killian Canine Performance Group, Grant's official business facade. She wore a worn brown coat. In her hand, 3 photos. 1. Aiden in the cage, blood dried on his neck. 2. The handmade collar Leah had created, found at the scene. 3. Aiden in the vet's care, medical notes outlining the chain injuries. She didn't walk in alone. A local reporter came with her, someone who'd followed Aiden's case since day 1. "Are you sure about this?" the reporter asked. "I don't need answers from them. I just need to make sure they can't stay silent anymore." At the front desk, the receptionist smiled politely and asked her to wait. Elena stood tall. Her hands didn't shake. A few minutes later, Grant Killian stepped out. Same pale brown suit, same polished shoes, same smug confidence. "Elena Riker," he said with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't expect you to visit." "I'm not here for a visit," she replied. "I'm here to return what you left behind." She laid the 3 photographs on the desk, one by one. Grant looked down. Didn't flinch. "I don't know what this is about," he said coolly. "These are serious accusations, Ms. Riker. I have a right to—" "You have the right to hire men, to hide names, to build a wall of paperwork around yourself, but you don't have the right to steal a member of my family and assume I'll sit quietly." The reporter snapped photos, the camera clicking softly in the tense silence. "You know something, Mr. Killian?" Elena leaned in, her voice low and razor-sharp. "Some truths don't need a courtroom. Some truths just need to be seen. Named. And after that, there's nowhere left to hide." Killian's jaw tightened. "You're playing a dangerous game. And you're playing the same old one. But this time, I'm not alone." When Elena left the building, she didn't look back. She knew she couldn't tear down a system overnight. But silence had been shattered. The reporter turned to her. "What do you think he'll do next?" "Retreat, cover up, maybe threatened, but now all eyes are on him, and we're not closing ours again. Ready when you are for the next chapter." 2 days later, an anonymous call came into the sheriff's station. Male voice. Quick, clipped words. "If you want to expose Killian, go to Grey Barn Camp. 10 p.m. Saturday. It's labeled a high-level training showcase, but it's actually a dogfighting ring. Legal permits keep them protected, but what really happens is brutal. Animals tortured for bets." Carson took the call. He relayed the message to Elena. But the police still couldn't move. No warrant, no cameras inside. The facility was leased under the name of an international entertainment group, layered in just enough legality to block direct action. "I'm going in," Elena said flatly. "No," Carson cut in. "It's too dangerous." "I've walked into red zones in Afghanistan with a fake ID and a steel wire wrapped around my ribs," she replied. "I think I can manage a dog camp in the middle of Wyoming." Carson stared at her, realizing there was no stopping her. At last, he exhaled. "Be careful. And take recording equipment." Saturday night, Elena stood outside the gates of Grey Barn Camp. Her hair was tied back, face half covered by a wide-brimmed hat. A dark leather jacket cloaked her frame, and her voice, calm, confident, matched the fake business card in her pocket. She was posing as a representative from an international pet insurance company. The security guard scanned the guest list. No Elena Riker. She pulled out a crisp $50 bill, leaned in, and whispered, "I'm here for Killian. I won't waste time." The gate opened. Inside, a converted warehouse flickered under dim yellow lighting. Bleachers lined the walls. The air was thick smoke, liquor, and wet fur twisted into something rancid. Guests sat in rows, not rowdy like a casino, just quiet, intense, charged. On the floor were dogs, leashed and waiting. Elena drifted toward the backstage area. Clipboard in hand, she pretended to take notes, asking a young handler about the performance lineup. Clueless, he handed her a list. Bare bones, but enough. She flipped page after page, then stopped at the 4th. GSD 14. Breed, German Shepherd Code. A 12-note. Extremely alert, requires a special handler. She didn't need a photo. Didn't need confirmation. Just 2 letters. GSD the breed. And the code, a 12. The same military designation Aiden carried. A code that was supposed to be erased. Elena's hand tightened around the clipboard. Then a low voice behind her. "That's an internal list, not meant for guests." She turned slowly. Grant Killian. No surprise, no anger. Just that same thin smile. "I figured you wouldn't stop after our last meeting," he said. Elena tucked the clipboard behind her back, steadying her breath. "And I figured you wouldn't stop either, even after being exposed." "We don't harm anyone here, Ms. Riker. Everything's professionally run. People pay to witness instinct, not injury. Instinct doesn't need chains, doesn't need starvation, doesn't require stripping a dog of its name," Elena shot back. "And anyone who calls this entertainment doesn't deserve to own a dog." Killian stepped closer. "You know what I respect most about you, Riker?" he said. "You don't know fear." Elena held his gaze. "I used to," she answered softly. "But now I know. Some things are worth standing up to. And one of them is men like you." Killian smiled, slow and thin, like he was listening to a bedtime story whose ending he'd already spoiled. "What do you think you're doing here, Riker? Crashing a legal dog event? Secret recordings? Leaking unverified claims?" "I'm naming the truth," Elena replied. Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed like iron. "And I won't be the only one saying it." Killian tilted his head, eyes turning darker. "You really think a few videos and blog posts will bring this system down?" "I don't need it to fall," she said. "I just need a light strong enough to show what's hiding in the dark." He stepped in, just close enough for their breath to mingle. "You've got a niece, don't you?" Elena didn't flinch. "Don't." "I'm just saying, don't let someone else pay the price for your stubbornness." Elena exhaled slowly, not from fear, but to keep from letting rage ruin her aim. "If you touch anyone in my family, even a strange number calling her phone, I'll make sure the entire country's eyes are on you. And I swear, no stack of paperwork will be enough to hide you then." Killian was quiet. 2 seconds. 3. Then he adjusted his cuff, stepping back. "You chose the game. You play by the rules." She nodded. "Just not yours." Elena didn't go home. She drove to a quiet roadside cafe, one with strong Wi-Fi and no questions asked. There, she plugged in the tiny hidden cam built into her coat. Everything had been captured. The conversation, the dog roster, the empty-eyed audience watching what was legally labeled a show. She typed one line into the email. "Carson, here's the piece you needed. I'm ready to testify. Attached the video. Hit send." A small ding echoed from the laptop like a starter's pistol in a war she had chosen to begin. When Elena got home, Leah was already asleep. Aiden lay beside her, breathing steady, eyes open, still standing watch. Elena slipped off her coat, stepped onto the porch, and stared towards the distant trees. The city lights beyond barely touched the horizon. But they were enough. Enough to remind her the world was still moving, and that Elena Riker was no longer on the sidelines. No more hiding, no more counting fears, no more waiting for permission to do what was right. In her pocket there was no weapon, no orders, no radio call, just a phone, a file, and a heart that had learned not to shake. The next morning, Carson called. "The footage is solid, very solid. I've passed it to the state prosecutor's office." "And Killian?" "He doesn't know yet, but we're stripping him down layer by layer. And this time, there's nowhere left to hide." Elena nodded, eyes drifting toward the window where Leah played in the yard. Aiden by her side, his nose twitching at the wind. "Then we don't stop now, Carson." "No," he replied. "We don't stop anymore." That afternoon, federal agents coordinated with state police to raid Gray Barn Camp. Surveillance drives, wire payments, transaction logs, each one a puzzle piece, fitting into a picture that had always been rotten beneath the surface. Grant Killian was handcuffed just as he stepped out of his luxury SUV. No expression, no denial. But this time there was no shield left to hide behind. The media was there. Cameras flashed, lenses clicked. 1,000 images snapped of the man who once believed the law couldn't touch him. From a distance, Elena didn't push forward, didn't speak. She just watched, hands in her coat, eyes calm, not angry, not triumphant. Just released. Not because Killian had been arrested, but because the fear inside her had finally fallen. Later, officers presented evidence: forged vaccine records, illegal transaction lists, force-based training gear. One of them brought Carson an old, spine-torn notebook. Found it in a locked safe, handwritten codes, training logs. Carson flipped through. Dog ID numbers, notes beside each temperament, obedience level, training duration, and near the end, marked in red: a .12 cannot be conditioned. The psychological bond too strong. Useless for underground use. Discard. Elena stared at the page, her heart pausing for a beat. Then she laughed, quiet and bitter. Not from anger, but because she understood now. Men like Killian never knew what they were trying to break. Aiden wasn't useless. He simply didn't belong in a world where loyalty had a price tag. He chose his family and never left. 3 days later, Elena was invited to speak at a small animal welfare summit. Among the crowd were people who once doubted her. I even laughed at her. Now they sat silent. Elena didn't read a speech, didn't bring notes. She just told a story, in her own voice, about a dog who'd pulled her out of the darkest nights, and how she found her way back by refusing to let anyone steal what she loved most. That evening, when she returned home, Aiden was lying on the old rug again. Leah curled beside him, a book resting on his paw. Elena sat near the window, cradling a cup of cold tea in her hands but wanting for nothing more. No victory parades, no fireworks, no medals, just the quiet knowing. The only enemy left to face. No longer lived inside her. Before bed, Leah whispered, "Aunt Elena, so it's over now, right?" Elena looked outside. The sky was calm. The moon, soft and steady, had risen above the treetops. "No," she said quietly. "It's never really over." "Why not?" "Because every day," Elena replied, "we still have to choose whether to keep standing or sit down." Leah nodded. "Then tomorrow, we stand again?" Elena smiled. "Tomorrow, we stand again." The next morning was calmer than any morning Elena had known since coming home from war. No sirens, no dreams snapping her awake in sweat. No suffocating silence or ghost-quiet footsteps on old floorboards. Just sunlight warming the porch. The scent of carrot bread Leah baked the night before. And the familiar tap-tap of Aiden's claws on the wooden floor. Elena opened her door. Leah was already up, carefully slicing carrots into tiny pieces and dropping them into Aiden's bowl, humming a tune only children can invent. Aiden lay nearby, stretched out, eyes fixed on her like he was watching a sacred ritual unfold. When he spotted Elena, his tail gave a soft wag. No bark, no rush, just eyes that waited until she sat beside him, like she always did. She walked slowly, each step a breath, and each breath carried a pulse she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Elena knelt, extended her hand open and waited. Aiden didn't hesitate. He shifted, nudged her palm with his nose, then lifted his head and pressed his forehead gently against her chest. No one taught him that. It wasn't a command, it wasn't muscle memory, it was a choice, and a greeting. Leah saw it and ran over. No asking, no fear. She dropped to her knees beside them, wrapped her arms around Aiden from behind, then rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I knew you'd come back to me." Aiden gave a low, soft groan, not in pain, but in understanding. Elena tried to speak, but she couldn't. For the first time in years after the battlefield, after the loss, after the endless storm of PTSD and sleepless nights, Elena cried. Not the kind of tears you bite down on, not the kind you hide behind closed doors, but the tears of a child who for once is allowed to fall into someone's arms without being judged. She cried. And Aiden didn't move. Leah didn't ask, "What's wrong?" She didn't wipe the tears. She just held tighter because sometimes we don't need answers. We just need each other. That day, there was no training, no commands, no tasks to check off. They just lived. Together, in the same house, on the same earth that, after everything, no longer trembled with fear, but exhaled a soft, safe rhythm. Elena looked up when she heard Leah giggling. Aiden had snatched the last piece of carrot. She didn't think about victories, or lawsuits, or the man now behind bars. She only thought, we didn't leave each other, and because of that, we still have everything. That night, after Leah had fallen asleep, Aiden lay curled at the foot of the bed, like he was guarding the quiet, making sure no nightmares would dare come near. Elena stayed up a little longer in her small office beside the kitchen. That room had once been filled with books on trauma, therapy manuals, worn notebooks, and a voice recorder, every tool she needed just to hold herself together. But tonight, she brought only one thing. A sand-colored journal, its corners browned, its spine peeling. The first page still held a faint smear of dried blood from the day she stuffed it into her flak jacket during a chaotic evacuation. Elena had once thought of burning it. More than once, she held a lighter over its cover, but she always stopped. This time, Elena didn't hold a lighter. She held a pen. The first page she turned back to was dated, Kandahar, September that year. Beneath it, a short entry. I watched a boy no older than Leah get hurt just for standing too close to the checkpoint. He did nothing wrong. He was just standing in the wrong place. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I was still on duty. Elena read those lines again, for the first time, without looking away, without her heart folding in on itself. It still hurt, but it was a hurt she could touch now. No longer a nameless black void. She flipped through more pages. One described a midnight field dressing, trying to save a teammate after shrapnel hit. 14 minutes of pressure and hope. He didn't make it. I don't know if I'm still a healer, or just someone who bears witness to the last wounds. Elena lowered her pen to the paper and wrote, I did everything I could, and today I'm still healing, starting with myself. She kept writing, not to remember, not to process, but to release. From the next room came Leah's soft voice, Auntie, Aiden's dreaming. He's wagging his tail in his sleep. Elena smiled and set the pen down. It's a good dream, sweetheart. What do you think he's dreaming about? I think, Elena said gently, he's dreaming of tomorrow. Back at her desk, she added one last line. Tomorrow is no longer something I fear. It's something I wait for. She closed the journal, her palm resting quietly on the cover. From the next room, Aiden let out a soft sigh, then settled back into stillness. Elena leaned into the chair and closed her eyes. Tomorrow will come. But this time, she would be the one to walk forward first. 1 week later, the town finally settled down. The media frenzy quieted. The headlines stopped printing photos of Aiden or sensational titles about the miracle veteran and her dog. That Sunday afternoon, Elena did something that wasn't on any schedule. No training, no interviews, no reporters, just a walk. She invited Leah and Aiden to come along. They wandered past the edge of the backyard into a small forest clearing Elena used to avoid. It reminded her too much of the remote fields in Afghanistan, where helicopters once landed in fog and fire. But now, it was different. A meadow of soft grass stretched ahead. The sky is golden. The breeze was so gentle it made the wildflowers whisper. Elena laid out a small blanket. Leah brought a basket of biscuits and a thermos of tea. Aiden, without being called, curled up beside them, his head resting on Elena's leg. 3 bodies. 3 heartbeats. 3 pasts, now woven into a single present. No one said anything. They didn't have to. Leah lay on her side, doodling on the ground with a blade of grass. Elena poured tea, her movements quiet, steady. Aiden half dozed, but one ear remained turned toward them, a guard's instinct, never fully off duty. The sky began to shift. The sun dropped, leaving a trail of soft orange light like a gentle farewell. Elena looked up. She no longer saw the world like a survivor. She saw it like someone who had been allowed to live again. Aiden stirred, placed his head in her open hand. Leah turned too, leaning against Elena's shoulder, her quiet smile still resting at the corner of her mouth. No big gestures, no conclusions, no grand lessons. Just this. They were still together, and for those who have known the full depth of loss, that alone is a miracle. The evening wind played gently with Elena's hair. She closed her eyes. And at that moment she wasn't a soldier, she wasn't a vessel of trauma, she was just a woman. Trusted completely by a dog, loved unconditionally by a little girl who called her Aunt, not because of blood, but because of heart. A woman who didn't need medals to feel worthy. A woman who didn't need applause to know she had lived rightly. The sun finally dipped below the hills. The sky deepened to lavender. Leah curled beside Aiden. Elena gently pulled the blanket over both of them. Then laid back, arms folded, eyes on the sky, just breathing, just here, still, together. Aiden's tail gave a soft wag, no longer like a soldier, no longer a victim, but like a living soul, still breathing, still loving, still a place someone could come home to. And Elena, for the first time, wasn't counting the things she had lost. She was counting the things she still had, and was still holding. A few months later, Elena's old cabin was no longer just a shelter. The surrounding land had been cleared. Wooden kennels were built. A small garden took root. A line of benches now faced the distant hills. Leah chose the name, Project Ember. Because fire doesn't have to blaze to stay alive, she said, eyes sparkling. As long as the embers glow, the fire's still there. Elena nodded, and all it takes is one breath to make it burn again. Project Ember didn't have fancy signs, no big budget, but it had the one thing that mattered most, a reason. Each month, they welcomed a few people, mostly veterans. Some hadn't slept through a night in years. Some had stood at the edge of balconies without knowing why they should go back inside. Alongside them came dogs that had been abandoned, aging canines, rescues from shelters, and those rejected for being untrainable. All of them met here, in a place with just enough sun, just enough wind, and a woman who once thought she'd never feel alive again. Elena didn't lecture. She didn't fix anyone. She simply sat beside them, gave small assignments, things like, take the dog to the riverbank. Don't speak, just walk. Write one sentence about yourself, but don't use the word past. Place your hand on the dog's back the next time your heart races. And Aiden, now a quiet symbol of everything resilient, lay beside those healing souls. No commands, no tricks, just presence, just enough for someone to reach out and learn that not everything broken has to be thrown away. One day, an old soldier, who hadn't spoken in 6 years, wept when Aiden laid his head in his lap. One night, a young woman who had been medicated into silence throughout her trauma therapy sat beside Leah and learn to draw dogs with gentle eyes. And one afternoon, Elena looked out her window and saw two men, both of whom had lost comrades in the same ambush, walking together with a blind dog between them. Neither man said a word, but both breathed a little deeper. A reporter once asked Elena, "What makes Project Ember different?" She smiled. "Because we're not trying to fix anyone. We just create space, so they can find their way back to themselves." At night, when the little lanterns along the porch flickered on, when footsteps echoed slowly down the wooden hall, when Aiden lay by the front steps and the breeze stirred the grass, Elena knew. Tomorrow would still bring unfinished business. The past could still show up uninvited. But this place, with imperfect people and dogs once forgotten. This place was a beginning, not a restart, but a continuation, with what's left of the heart. She shut the window, returned to her desk, and opened the old war journal, now more than halfway full. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Today, Aiden slept by my feet. Leah drew a dog with wings. And me, for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel like anything was missing." Outside, the wind kept moving. But inside, the fire had caught. At Project Ember, no 2 days were the same. Some were quiet, just people and dogs under the trees, saying nothing at all. Some were chaos, when a veteran suffered a panic attack and a newly rescued dog refused to eat. But one thing never changed. Every soul here was learning how to live again, not to get back to normal, but to find peace on their own terms. There was Rob, a combat veteran who hadn't left his house in 3 years due to severe anxiety. He was paired with Sienna, a blind Labrador who had been abandoned after her vision failed. On the first day, both were afraid of the crunch of boots on gravel. By the 3rd week, they walked side by side, past the fence. Rob didn't need medication. Sienna didn't need a leash. They only needed each other. There was a young woman named Casey. She had survived domestic violence. She was paired with a dog named Echo, abandoned after a car crash left one of his legs permanently weakened. Casey didn't believe in anyone. Echo didn't believe anyone would stay. But after 2 months, people began to see Casey sitting quietly in the yard, reading aloud to Echo. And Echo, curled by her feet, eyes closed, breathing steady like a child finally resting. It wasn't a miracle. It was just 2 beings relearning how to trust. Elena never called it therapy. She didn't track progress with charts. She simply sat beside them when needed. And let Aiden take over when words fell short. One veteran, who had tried to end his life 5 times, spent a quiet afternoon by the river with Aiden. At the end of it, he whispered, "For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't afraid to look at the water." Elena wrote that down in her journal, not to hold on to, but to remind herself, even the smallest step is a kind of resurrection. Leah, now older, better at drawing, better at reading canine eyes than most adults, often taught the veterans how to do something surprisingly hard. Just sit still. "Not everyone needs to do something to feel better," she'd say. "Sometimes sitting quietly with a creature that doesn't speak is enough." Everyone chuckled when they heard that. But eventually, they all tried it, and all of them felt a little lighter. One afternoon, Elena sat on the bench near the small garden. Around her, people who had once hit rock bottom were now watering delicate flower beds, or scratching the ears of drowsy dogs sprawled out on sunlit bricks. She saw a man who once said, "I died in 2010, now holding a camera, capturing a moment of Leah and Aiden playing. She saw another, discharged from service for being mentally unstable, now calmly recording the dog's vaccine schedule in neat blue ink. She saw things she once thought were extinguished, now glowing quietly again. No one said it out loud. No one gave it a name. But Elena knew. This was what she had once lost. And now, what she had chosen to rebuild. With her whole heart. Someone once asked her, "How long will Project Ember last?" She answered, "As long as there's someone who hasn't given up." That evening, the sun was gentle. The breeze is just enough to soften the edges of the world, as if the sky itself had learned how to ease up for hearts once torn apart. Elena stood on the porch, tea in hand, watching Leah and Aiden in the yard. Leah chased butterflies through the lavender bushes, arms waving in slow arcs. Aiden didn't chase, but bounded around her in short, eager hops. Sometimes leaping at a pale flutter of wings, sometimes glancing back at her as if to ask, "Ready? Should I keep going?" Leah's laughter rang out. Soft, but enough to melt into the golden air. Aiden wagged his tail, didn't bark, just bounced once more, then flopped into the grass, tongue out, eyes half shut, ears still perked. Elena didn't call them, didn't join in. She just stood there, one hand wrapped around the warm tea, letting herself breathe in time with someone else's joy. The breeze caught her coat. A butterfly drifted past the railing. Elena reached out not to catch it, just to feel that it was really there. Then she looked back at Aiden and Leah, and somewhere inside her, not in words, not out loud, Elena whispered, "Healing isn't forgetting. It's continuing, and we are continuing." The next day, a weathered man appeared at the gates of Project Ember, carrying a faded backpack. On his chest, stitched into his worn jacket, was a frayed patch, the insignia of an old unit. He didn't say much, only asked, "Is there a place here for someone who isn't sure they've got enough left to start again?" Elena turned to Aiden, resting under a tree nearby, eyes open, waiting. Elena smiled and nodded. "We don't need people who are ready. We just need people brave enough to walk in even if they're trembling." That man, later, would be paired with a dog who'd lost one ear in an accident. They didn't talk much, but everyone saw them, walking together each evening, moving in their own rhythm. Slow but steady. A few weeks later, a new arrival asked Leah, "What do you do here?" She paused, thought for a moment, then said, "I'm here to remind people that it's still possible to feel joy even after you've been sad for a really long time." Aiden, like a quiet breath, kept doing exactly what he was born to do. Be there. No tricks, no explanations, just presence. And for people who had once been abandoned, that alone was a miracle. At the end of each day, Elena would write a single line in her notebook. Who smiled today? Beneath it, she'd jot a name. No rules, no right answers. Some days it was a new guest, some days a dog, and some days it was her. The journal was nearly full now, but Elena didn't feel the need to start a new one. She'd write to the very last page and then close it. Tuck it away, like a letter never meant to be reread, but kept as proof. It was written. That evening, the sun melted behind the hills. Leah had fallen asleep on the wooden bench, head resting on Aiden's shoulder. Aiden sat still, eyes lifted toward the purpling sky. Elena approached quietly. She didn't wake them. She just sat down beside them, and needed nothing else, no medals, no applause, no validation, just two living beings breathing, existing, believing, and her once shattered still writing her story forward. With presence. We often think it takes time to heal a heart, but sometimes the miracle begins with a single look. From a dog who doesn't need words to understand, and doesn't need a reason to stay. Aiden was not just a German shepherd. He was a living symbol of loyalty, of a connection that defies the limits between species and souls. In his eyes was the steady gaze of a friend willing to walk with you through the storm of memory. In his breath, echoes of broken spirits that never gave up on each other. And in the journey of Elena, of Leah, of all those who had once been undone, Aiden was the red thread, the quiet ember that helped light the path back to hope. German shepherds with their sharp minds, deep protective instinct, and gentle hearts aren't just pets. They're family. The friend who never asks, "Are you okay?" but somehow always knows when to sit beside you. This story isn't just about reunion. It's a reminder that every soul, even the wounded ones, deserve love. That every broken piece placed in the right hands can become the foundation for something stronger. And sometimes, to begin again, all we need is a wag of the tail and the warm breath of a creature who speaks no words, but never, ever leaves. Love dogs not just because they're loyal, but because they teach us how to love again, even after we've been hurt. And if you're carrying something that hasn't healed yet, remember, somewhere out there, a dog like Aiden might be waiting for you to realize you are still worthy of being held with a whole heart.